The story begins with a fair-haired girl talking about a dream she had the previous night, in which she dreamed she was dying. The guy sitting next to her suggested it was a bad dream. The girl laughed and said that such language was not allowed in the palace. Soon after, he sighed and said it could have been a prophetic dream. He advised them to go and listen to the fortune teller who had come down. The girl smiled and said that all this was invented by their ancestors to pass on power through the royal lineage. By the way, even if many people believe it, it doesn't mean it's actually true. The guy said he understood all of this, but wasn't she the one talking about a meaningless dream? The girl sighed heavily and asked if he could be a little more serious. For the first time in a long time, she invited him into the garden to sit with her. The guy looked at her in surprise, then looked back at the book and said that even now she was wasting his precious time. The girl ignored his disinterest and said that they could continue talking about her dream from yesterday. This dream allowed her to see herself from the outside. She felt as if her soul had left her body. There was pitch darkness around her and the sounds of the sea waves, and he was the only one who was near her. At that moment, the guy said he'd be identified as the most influential criminal and arrested. Our heroine smiled admiringly and said she wanted to see it. After all, this was an ancient wizard sitting before her, imprisoned under royal guard. The boy glanced at her, saying she loved causing him trouble. The girl laughed and told him that everyone who saw him wanted to rip off that mask. The guy replied that he didn't wear a mask, and if you peeled off his skin, all that remained was flesh and bones. After that, he turned his head and asked if she was sure about tomorrow. After all, a judgment based on real facts would finally become reality. At that moment, the wind lifted our heroine's hair. Lost in thought, she said she had a premonition, and she thought it would be good if he were by her side. The guy, without stopping reading the book, said that if she had the ability to predict the future, then she could do whatever she wanted. Suddenly, our heroine suggested that he could make sure he fell in love with her. The guy instantly slammed his book shut. Rising from his chair, he said that if she brought it up again, he was leaving. Confused, the girl asked Kiltz's Cadian to stop. She asked to look at him. Kiltz turned his head and asked if she was really going to order him to kneel. The girl looked at him in surprise. Looking into his eyes, she said that he was not a knight of the royal family, but an all-powerful wizard of the ivory tower, and she was absolutely ordinary. The guy said she's a commoner related to Bookbo by blood. Does she worship him as the embodiment of Ingram? The girl replied that she wasn't talking about social status or other people's opinions. She said this to get him interested. She added that he always likes to listen to something special and interesting. The girl reached out to Kiltz and began talking about the dream she had spoken of earlier. In this dream, she was close to death, but she was not afraid, as others would have been. The reason for this was that he was next to her. His eyes seemed to have been looking at her for 2 months. That's why she wanted to thank him. But after that, she only walked behind his back. They were in the darkness, and she grew in that darkness where it was impossible to see anything. And together, they walked towards the starry sea. The boy asked in surprise what the end of that journey was, and the girl responded by reminding him that he was a wizard who knew everything. She begged him to answer her. Even her death would not leave him indifferent. Just for one day, even for a moment, could he love her? The action shifts to another time period. The girl was running across a field, thinking that something was missing. She knew that lambs and horses lived here. There were villages, a vast sea, and something else. Here she is! Our heroine plucked a small bouquet of flowers and gazed at it admiringly. Soon she became thoughtful. Looking at him, she asked herself, would Daddy like this gift? After this, the girl turned her head in surprise and asked the sheep why she was eating these beautiful flowers. With a heavy sigh, the girl said that she too would like to eat only grass, and then she would definitely never be hungry. Then she raised her head and looked into the distance. A vast, endless sea stretched out before her. The girl, of course, was delighted, but at some point she decided that it was worth returning. After that, she noticed something strange out of the corner of her eye, so she decided to turn around to look at it. At first, she saw a bird's wing, so she thought it was a crow, but something was wrong. Her eyes felt strange, so she scratched them and immediately noticed that it was a person and not a crow. Our heroine didn't understand who could have come here, but she came closer to make sure he wasn't dead. Removing the stranger's hood, she noticed that his face was incredibly handsome, but what was that on his eye? The girl immediately assumed that he was crying, so she began to reach out to him to wipe away the tear. The moment she touched him, the stranger's eyes began to open. Our heroine jumped up in horror and ran away. Her shocked scream echoed for a radius of 200 meters. The guy didn't even have time to introduce himself. Seeing the girl, he asked in confusion if it was Rose. He couldn't believe his eyes, so he lunged at her, grabbing her by the shoulders. Not understanding what was happening, our heroine began screaming even louder. Soon the girl was able to escape from the hands of the stranger, and as soon as she did so, she began to run as far away as possible. The action takes us to a nearby village, where various activities were in full swing. Residents were trading, tending to their homes, and so on. In turn, our heroine burst into her home in horror and immediately slammed the door. A man immediately approached her and in bewilderment began shouting and asking her where she had been hanging around all this time. The man angrily continued to say that the house was a mess and that she should clean it up. The girl began to sheepishly say that she had been picking flowers from the rocks. Suddenly, the girl's hand felt a strange tingle, so she fixed her gaze on it. The owner of the house sat down on a chair, took a swig from the bottle, and asked why he had to waste his free time on such nonsense. He ordered her to lick every corner of the house. The girl could do nothing but quietly nod her head. While she was doing her job, the man continued to rant, asking how she could become so impudent and useless. He sighed heavily and said his whole day was ruined whenever he saw her. The girl was upset by her father's behavior, as she had hoped he would be kinder if she brought flowers. However, because of that guy, she couldn't bring the bouquet. Anyway, at that moment, she got up and told her father that she would get him some water. The girl approached the front door to leave the house, and as soon as she opened the door, she noticed in front of her the stranger she had met in the forest. From such a surprise, she again screamed in bewilderment and horror, and her cries echoed throughout the village. The man stood up from his chair perplexed and asked his daughter what was wrong. Why was she screaming so much? The girl, her voice trembling, asked the stranger how he had gotten there. The boy, for his part, said nothing. He simply glanced at her and then at his father, who was standing among a whole pile of empty wine bottles. What he saw evoked nothing but contempt. He took a step inside anyway. The man shouted in disbelief and asked who he was. Entering someone else's house was illegal. However, Kiltz asked only one question. How old was the girl? The man asked again, perplexed. He then said that his daughter was now 10 years old, but what did he want from her? The wizard sighed heavily and muttered something under his breath. He soon said he knew how it sounded, but he would say it bluntly. Kiltz wants to take this child away. The man immediately screamed in bewilderment and asked how dare he take his child away and talk about such things. Pointing the bottle at the stranger, he said he'd literally fallen on their heads and was now talking nonsense. The man told him to get lost. Kiltz, however, preferred a more effective method to 1,000 words, so he simply took out a bag of gold and placed it on the table. Our heroine's father's face instantly changed. He asked in bewilderment, was he really going to give that much for this girl? The wizard wasn't much of a talker anyway, so he simply asked if that was enough. The man fell to the ground and began to say that it was enough. Kiltz said he was glad, but now they needed to think things through. The man looked up in confusion and asked what that meant. The wizard said that he should understand that for such a sum, one could buy an entire castle, and he thought that it was worth even more than that, but he did not understand its value. Kiltz crossed his arms and added that they should discuss how much its price had dropped. The wizard asked the man point blank if he had ever beaten his daughter. He immediately began scratching his head nervously. Kiltz wasn't stupid, so he could tell when a person was lying and when he was hiding something, so he removed some from the pile of gold coins. Soon he raised his head and looked at the man again, asking if he had ever scolded her. Silence again. Kiltz's eyes instantly filled with contempt. The wizard separated another portion from the pile of gold coins. After that, the questions continued. Did he teach her to read and write? Did he care for her at all? Did she even have a childhood? Obviously, the man could not answer positively to any of these questions, so in the end, a small handful of coins was offered in exchange for the girl. The wizard said that was exactly the amount he could pay. In that moment, the man was overcome with rage. He began to shout and ask in bewilderment if he understood how he had suffered raising this shameless girl. The wizard responded by saying that he could have simply cut him down instead of giving him the gold, so it was worth thanking the girl that this simply did not happen. Hearing these words, the man even fell to the ground in fear. He didn't want to say anything against this psychopath. After some time, our heroine began to approach her father, asking if he would give her to a strange uncle. However, there was no answer. The girl, perplexed, continued asking her father, hoping for an answer. At that moment, the man turned around, and gold coins fell from his hands. With a strange smile, the father asked his daughter if she was obedient. The girl immediately understood what this meant and began begging her father not to give her away. He in turn said that this man would feed and clothe her well. Our heroine began to panic because she could not believe what was happening, and Kilt sighed and said that he would find them a carriage. The girl continued to beg her dad not to abandon him because she didn't want to say goodbye to him. She promised to clean the whole house and keep doing it forever. However, the man pulled his hand away, telling his daughter to shut up because he had no way to refuse. The man was angry, so he kicked the stool and told the girl not to irritate him. After that, he calmed down a little, but looking at the girl, he couldn't help but notice how ill she was. The man sighed heavily. Then he asked her to listen to him carefully, and kneeling down, he said that he should have told her long ago that she was not his real daughter. Hearing these words, the girl didn't even know how to react, because it seemed to her that this was some kind of unfunny joke. In turn, the man began to tell the story of how he accidentally found her on the beach 10 years ago. He thought he might be a lost child of the aristocrats, so he decided to take him. The man took her in the hope of receiving a reward, but in the end, no one came to her. After that, he injured his leg and could no longer work. There was nowhere to get money. There was even a feeling that he was being held hostage by her. So he was constantly angry. But at that moment, his voice, as well as his hand, began to tremble. He held up a gold coin. Soon after, he started laughing madly, saying that he could start over from scratch. Our heroine was in incredible shock, because on that day, she learned and felt too many emotions. After that, she sighed and said she would go with that man. The girl's father was glad to hear this. After a while, Kiltz heard the sound of the door opening, so he turned his head. In front of him, he saw Rose, but for some reason, her hair was cut. Kiltz looked at the man in bewilderment and asked what the hell he was doing. What had he done? The man replied that now they could dress her up more beautifully. Kiltz assumed he was taking him for a fool, and even decided to sell the last strand of hair to someone. In any case, he hugged the girl and said that she was now his child, and if he tried to reach out to her, he would quickly lose them. Looking at him with a piercing gaze, Kiltz said that he should be glad he didn't do it right away. Then he turned to the girl and said that he had not found the most comfortable carriage, so he hoped that she could be patient for a little while. However, our heroine had never ridden in a carriage before, and she had nothing to compare it to. But what difference did it make if she'd just been sold? At that moment, Kiltz looked at the girl and her bag in surprise, and asked if those were all her things. The girl nodded quietly. Having lifted the girl, the boy said that they would take another carriage as soon as they arrived at a larger village. A couple of seconds later, they settled into their seats, and our heroine's father continued to watch them go. The girl understood that today was the first time he'd been honest with her, so she wanted to ask him more than anything. Had he ever loved her? Our heroine looked at the man and thanked him for raising her. Finally, she also advised him not to drink as much as he had been drinking before all this. Immediately after these words, the coachman ordered the horse to run, and so the carriage moved off. The man still wanted to say something, but it was too late. After some time, they were leaving the city, so the girl turned around and began to look at her native village for the last time and say goodbye. Soon she sat down in her seat and began to cry. Kiltz couldn't help but notice, so he asked in surprise if she really loved him. Of course, there was no answer as the girl tried to hide her tears. The boy, surprised, told her that her father had been harsh with her all this time, and yet she wiped away her tears, saying that it didn't matter. An image of that same energetic and cheerful girl suddenly appeared before Kiltz's eyes. He muttered something under his breath. Our heroine closed her mouth in confusion, wondering if he was angry. At that moment, he simply lowered his head down, as if he was trying to say something. Our heroine was looking forward to these words, and she also didn't mind looking at him because he was always turned away from her. Suddenly, the cart hit a rock, and they began to shake. The girl immediately grabbed her mouth, trying to control herself. Kiltz suggested she close her eyes, and that would help. Our heroine was still able to overcome this urge, and soon after decided to remind him that during all this time, he still hadn't. The boy interrupted her and said her name was Kiltz. The girl asked if she understood correctly that he was Mr. Kiltz, to which he replied that to her, he was simply Kiltz. The girl became thoughtful. She wanted to know what was going on. By the way, her father had said she might be the daughter of an aristocrat. At that moment, she also remembered how in one of the bars, he said that there was still slavery in Izmikan, so it was necessary to sell the girl there. Our heroine had no idea what slavery was, but he sold her anyway and got the gold. At that moment, the boy decided to ask her name. The girl, still lost in her thoughts, looked at Kiltz in surprise and said her name was Asha Konak. At that moment, the girl, perplexed, began asking why she had been singled out. There were plenty of other children in the village. Kiltz, perplexed, asked what she was talking about. Soon the girl calmed down and said that she was even glad that they bought her. Asha looked at the man and thanked him for giving her father money. Kiltz, surprised, asked why she was thanking him. The girl forced a smile onto her face and said that perhaps her father would be happier with them than with her. These words touched Kiltz so deeply that it was terrifying to even think about how much this monster had neglected her. He needed to end him immediately. However, he said the words about killing him out loud, causing tears to appear in Asha's eyes. Confused, the boy began to say that that wasn't what he meant. He wasn't angry at her, and besides, she still didn't know where they were going. The girl asked dejectedly if they were really going to Izmikan. Kiltz was certainly surprised by this answer, but said that it was not so because they were going to mountainous Corinthia, because this was the only way to leave the steppe. The guy asked if she knew where it was. Hearing no answer, he told her anyway. It's next to Nurmuz. Although you couldn't really call it a country, just lands that had separated from Kaldrogan. There's also a village called Liez, on the edge of the steppe. And at that moment, Asha leaned on Kiltz's arm. The boy was surprised. However, he was glad that she had calmed down and was able to sleep, so he covered her with a blanket and let her rest. After a while, the action takes us to the city that Kiltz spoke about. Everything here was new to our heroine, so she looked around in admiration. The guy started saying that Liez is located on the edge of the steppe, so it's always crowded with travelers. The town itself isn't very big, but there are several good hotels. However, Asha was shocked by these words, because looking at all these buildings, it was very strange to hear that this is not a very big city. At this point, Kiltz turned to the girl and said that before going anywhere, she would need to pick out some new clothes. Our heroine felt a little embarrassed at that moment. She felt a little ashamed, but she hadn't seen anyone wearing such old clothes. But the girl, of course, agreed to go and look at the clothes, but something stopped her. Kiltz asked what was wrong. She raised her head and said that she had no money at all. Kiltz looked at her in bewilderment and said that he would pay for her. Asha immediately assumed this would increase her debt, so she said everything was fine and that she didn't need new clothes. Kiltz asked if she had a change of clothes. The girl quietly said that she didn't have any other clothes, but she could wash what she had on. In that case, he asked in surprise what she would wear while these clothes were drying. Asha paused for thought. Kiltz sighed heavily, took her hand, and led her along, telling her that she should just follow him. Our heroine understood that this was very bad because then her debt would increase. However, after a while, the action takes us to the shop. The guy happily greeted the gentleman, saying they had some rooms available. Kiltz asked for 2 single rooms with meals. The guy said they'd take care of everything now, and they could move on. In fact, the guy immediately headed towards the stairs and started climbing them, and Asha followed him. By the way, they never bought the clothes, and our heroine couldn't understand how she would be able to repay the debt. After a while, they reached the room, and Kiltz asked her to come inside. The girl opened the door and saw all this beauty. She even thought it wouldn't be a shame to pay 3 writs for something like this. Anyway, they'd looked, and that was it. The girl ran into another room. Kiltz, perplexed, asked where she was going. Taking her in his arms, he brought her back and pushed her into the room, saying that she needed to rest and that he would leave for a while. Soon, the door slammed shut, leaving the girl alone inside. Asha couldn't understand. Had the man really gotten into the wrong room? The girl decided to wait a bit, as he would soon understand what had happened and the limit. At that moment, a voice rang out from behind. Asha turned around joyfully, as if she knew this would happen. However, a girl stood before her and said she had drawn a bath. She then asked if Asha needed help. The girl, perplexed, began waving her arms and head, saying that this wasn't her room. This surprised the girl. She immediately looked out and looked at the sign near the door, saying that she didn't think so. Moreover, she said that her dark-haired companion had sent her here to keep an eye on her. In any case, she needed to wash quickly before the water got cold. After a while, the action takes us to the bathroom, where our heroine was lying and warming herself. The nanny asked her if she needed help. Asha immediately got up and began bathing, saying everything was fine. At that moment, the girl even realized that she had never bathed in such hot water. Suddenly, the nanny said that a change of clothes would be outside the door, so Asha would have to go downstairs as soon as she finished. As soon as the girl came out of the bathroom and looked at the clothes, she realized that Kiltz had still done it his way. After this, the girl began to think that this guy probably just cared about her. As soon as our heroine got dressed, she headed up the stairs to go down to the dining room where Kiltz was sitting. The girl approached him and thanked him for the bath and new clothes. Kiltz, oddly enough, was still reading. Turning the page, he said that all this was nonsense, and these clothes were just for now. Later, they would buy something better. However, Asha began to shake her head, saying that this would be enough for her. Soon after, she assured Kiltz that she would work hard to pay off the debt. These words even made the guy freeze. He looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked how much debt they were talking about. The guy sighed heavily and said he didn't know why she thought that, but there was no need. The girl was confused again because he was angry with her. What happened? However, she decided that she shouldn't give up, so she leaned over and said that she was good at cleaning. She also said that she gets along well with people and even looked after Mrs. Linda's baby, so she figured she could become a nanny and pay off the debt. Then she started thinking about what else she could do. She remembered that she could climb and scramble well, but she didn't know if it would be of any use. At that moment, Kiltz slammed the book shut. The guy asked her to stop talking about it because he couldn't listen to it anymore. Looking at the girl, he asked her never to say such a thing to him again. These words deeply hurt our heroine, and she was at a loss to understand. It took Kiltz a moment to realize what he had just said, so he began to tell the girl that he hadn't meant it. However, at that moment, the waitress arrived with the food. Looking at Asha, she said that after her bath, she looked like a little noblewoman. Anyway, she put the food on the table and asked the girl not to be shy and to eat. Soon after Kiltz told her she could eat, the girl immediately began looking at all this wonderful food in delight. Asha began grabbing everything within reach and enjoying the food. Kiltz glanced at her and asked if she really enjoyed it that much. The girl smiled and said it was delicious. At that moment, Kiltz smiled back and said he'd gone to the stables. It had been difficult to find a wagon with a roof. In any case, he said they would now be able to cross the prairie safely. Asha looked at him in surprise and asked what a prairie was. Kiltz asked if she didn't know about the Nirma's steppes. They had to cross them to reach the rest of the continent, but that would take at least a month. Our heroine asked again, surprised. The guy repeated the same, saying that this was prairie. After all, there would be almost no settlements along the way, so they needed to stock up on supplies. Kiltz also said that many people say a demon lives there. The girl was scared, but the waitress said that he was often seen there and that he had never been there before. At that moment, she pointed to a group of people and said that they were also going to travel across the prairie so they could go together. By the way, they were traders. Kiltz sighed, however, and said he couldn't stand noise. The girl laughed and suggested they take a sheep that would distract the demon. Kiltz in turn assured her they wouldn't need it. Meanwhile, our heroine was beside herself. At that moment, the girl was horrified and wondering, was Kiltz really using her as a sheep? A room, clothes, even food. Could this really be her last supper? Kiltz looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked what was wrong with hers. Asha nervously and sharply turned her head and said everything was fine. In turn, she decided he couldn't be trusted. The action shifts to the next morning. Kiltz was already outside near the cart. Asha had just come out to him, and he told her it was time for them to leave. Our heroine had her things back and was ready to go, but her condition wasn't the best. Kiltz noticed it too and decided she'd even gotten thinner. As soon as they set off, the waitress began to see them off and say how she hoped nothing would happen to them. Finally, she wished them a safe journey. Our heroine smiled back and thanked her for the comfort. However, the words about a safe journey made her wary. Looking at Kiltz, she decided that this couldn't happen to him. In any case, the wizard merely looked at the road and drove on. Incidentally, they were now heading for the Grave of the Winds. After a while, they found themselves in a completely empty field. Our heroine peered around in bewilderment. Everything here was new to her. Kiltz assumed she was seeing the prairie for the first time, so he asked her how she felt. Asha replied that it was amazing. It was so big, but all you could hear was the wind. The wizard said there are many mystical places on the continent, and the Nirma's Steppe is one of the top 3 magic trains or teleportation scrolls are useless here. To put it simply, he said that magic doesn't work here, although this may seem like an advantage. However, when it comes to enemy invasions, This could backfire on them, as the territories were isolated from the rest of the continent. The guy said that while railroads were being built in other places, the Nirma's people felt abandoned, so they separated from Kaldrigans. Asha said that she understood everything, and then looked into the distance, and seeing huge mountains, she asked in surprise how big the world was. Kiltz immediately reached into his bag and soon pulled out a map. He said it was a map of the continent, and the prairie they were now crossing was marked. The girl began to examine the map, thinking that it was quite small. Would she be able to visit all these places? Suddenly, Kiltz looked at the girl and asked if she wanted to go too. Just as suddenly, he fell silent. Asha looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. But Kiltz asked her to forget about it because everything was fine. However, at that moment, Kiltz saw several silhouettes in front of him, which meant that someone was approaching them. After a while, a group of men ran up to Kiltz and Asha, asking if they had come from Liazis. The wizard nodded his head and said that everything was correct. But what did they need? The guys immediately advised them to turn around, as there was a demon on the way. They also asked not to ask them what trouble this monster had brought them. The boy suddenly sighed and asked the strangers if they knew he hadn't been here before. Some thought it was a bad change. Looking at them, he advised them to at least return to the city for weapons, because the demon was very strong. However, at that moment, Kiltz told them that they did not look like the natives of Nirmaz. The brunette looked at the stranger in bewilderment and asked how he understood this. He explained that the people from Nirmaz would not have taken the body away, but would have buried it on the spot. The young man smiled, saying that the gentleman had good intuition. They were merchants from Astier. Had they heard that Nirmaz was famous for the high quality of its wool? He explained that they wanted to establish trade, but ended up getting into trouble. However, Kiltz sighed and said that they would somehow manage on their own. The two merchants snorted, saying it would be their own fault, while the brunette said in surprise that Kiltz looked like he'd never held a sword. In any case, he warned. They concluded by saying that no one could know what might happen. Soon after, their paths diverged. After a while, it got dark and it started to rain. Covering himself with his hood, the boy said his intuition had never failed him. Looking at Asha covered with a blanket, he said that they would stay here today. Thus the horse moved slowly forward, and inside the carriage sat our heroes. Asha didn't know what to say or how to talk, so she sat silently. At that moment, Kiltz broke the silence. He asked the girl if she was afraid of the demon. Our heroine, in turn, looked at Kiltz and thought that he seemed much scarier to her. At this point, the guy said that the people they saw could be the reason for the demon's appearance. If they weren't lying about coming from Astier, they could be scouts for the construction of the railway, which is why they were so nervous. They look like they're specialists conducting a preliminary inspection of the area. They're definitely not traders. No loaded carts, no workers, and so on. In short, these guys lied to them, only pretending to be traders. Asha asked if he was sure about that. Of course, the guy said he wasn't entirely sure, because there was so little information. Firstly, it's impossible to use magic in the steppe. That's a fact. The demon's appearance is a side effect of the human invasion. If they hadn't tried to use magic here, the demon wouldn't have appeared. And now it's a vicious circle. Demons are being fought with the magic that creates them. Very strange. Asha trembled as she listened to this story. The guy suddenly said that she didn't have to be afraid of anything because she was safe with him and he guaranteed it. At that moment, he extended his hand outside and said that the rain would soon stop. It would clear up by morning, and it was best to go to bed now. After that, he looked at the girl and said that it would be better for her not to listen to the sounds outside at all. Asha was even more frightened by these words, so she asked in surprise why this should not be done. Kiltz looked at her with his piercing gaze and said that this way she would be safer. After some time, Kiltz was asleep, and our heroine was lying under a blanket, looking up at one point. She suddenly stood up because she was wondering how long it would take to get to the village if they didn't have a cart and a horse. By the way, she was interested in why it was necessary to go all the way to this village. Looking at this guy, she couldn't figure out what he was planning. In any case, she just didn't want to die, and there was no point in thinking about unnecessary things. At that moment, strange sounds began to come from outside. An unfamiliar voice seemed to be calling Asha to it. Our heroine immediately decided that these were the sounds Kiltz was talking about. It was so scary! Yet the voice continued to call her. At one point, the girl even realized that the voice sounded like her father's. The voice said it was true. It was him, so it was time for them to go home. The girl immediately jumped up and began to lean forward, asking if it was really him. A puzzled voice asked, wouldn't she recognize her own father? In any case, he suggested they go home. He decided it would be better to return every penny and take her, so he told Asha it was time for them to go home. The girl was incredibly happy that her dad had come to pick her up. Now the girl understood why Kiltz had asked her not to listen to the sounds. He knew her dad would come back for her. As she climbed out of the carriage, she even wondered why she should listen to this stranger at all. The girl began following the voice and even ran across the field. She asked where her father was, to which the voice replied that he was nearby. She was looking forward to their meeting so soon she finally came out of the bushes in the hope of seeing her father, but in front of her, she saw an unfamiliar and strange light silhouette that was calling her. Our heroine instantly replaced her happy smile with a nervous one. It definitely wasn't Dad. Moreover, she realized that it was not even a person, so she began to run away from it and scream, and the silhouette rushed in pursuit. The girl ran in tears, thinking about how scared she was. She couldn't see anything in front of her and wanted to get home as quickly as possible. Suddenly, she wondered, did she even own this house? In any case, the monster's hand was getting closer and closer. At some point, the monster almost grabbed the girl, and she finally screamed the name Kiltz. At that very moment, lightning flashed, followed by more lightning. A wizard hung in the air. Soon the guy started blowing up everything around him. Loud and bright flashes began to be heard. Of course, he couldn't do this just like that, so he prematurely protected the girl with a protective bubble. Our heroine was incredibly surprised. Could this really be magic? She suddenly remembered her father's words. The man told me how he once saw a wizard when he was a mercenary. That guy could move a mountain in an instant and turn the sea into a desert. It might even seem that he was not a man at all because his powers were incredible. At that moment, Kiltz turned his head towards Asha, wanting to say something. His eyes were filled with rage. The girl was horrified to realize that he would think that she wanted to run away and might demand that she return all the money. Remembering her father and his parenting methods, she even suggested that he might hurt her. Nevertheless, the boy ran up to the girl and grabbed her, trying to bring her to her senses. Asha only began to scream in horror. Kiltz tried to calm her down, telling her it was him, but the girl kept apologizing, saying she really didn't mean to do that. She hadn't even thought of running away. However, no screams followed. Kiltz hugged her tightly, telling her what he had lost and barely managed to find. The guy repeated the same phrases with tears in his eyes, telling Asha that he thought he would never see her again. The girl looked down in bewilderment and asked if she had really been used as bait. Kiltz, perplexed, asked what she was talking about, and she answered that she thought she would be given to the devil, and if she ran away, Dad would get nothing. The boy was so shocked he couldn't even speak. Kiltz covered his face with his hand, and tears began to roll down his eyes. He said that everything was definitely not. As she said, she was mistaken. He didn't take her for this. In that case, Asha decided to ask why he needed her. Why did he take her? Without a shred of doubt, Kiltz said he wanted to make her happy. Our heroine's face instantly changed. She doesn't have to worry about money, and he can swear to it as many times as he wants. He'd give an entire continent just to have her by his side. Asha, perplexed, asked why he treated her this way, to which Kiltz replied that she was a very important person to him. The girl didn't understand what he was talking about, since they had only met 2 days ago. How could this be true? That's why she looked at him and said that she didn't deserve such words from him. In any case, by this time, the rain was gradually stopping, so Kiltz decided to get up. In the same way, the guy extended his hand to her, telling her that she needed to get up, otherwise she would get sick. Just a couple of minutes later, the weather cleared up again, and the sun began to come out. Kiltz suddenly told the girl that he'd been asking a lot of people about her. Asha asked in surprise if he was her father. The guy said he wasn't. Her father was someone else, but he couldn't say who it was yet. In any case, she was very dear to him. Taking her hand, he said that this was the only reason he had to protect her, even at the cost of his life. The girl was incredibly shocked by these words, so she said that she could not give anything in return. Once again, Asha noticed that Kiltz's face had changed, and that alone made her think that he was angry with her again. However, to her surprise, he placed his hand on her head and began to stroke it. What was going on? The girl raised her head in surprise, still unable to believe what was happening. Moreover, it looks like Kiltz is sad right now. At that moment, the guy finally broke the silence, telling her that she didn't have to give anything back. He'd already been paid enough. Asha suddenly asked if he was angry. Kilt's, surprised, asked what she was talking about. The girl reminded him that she had run away even though she shouldn't have. The guy in turn said it was only his fault since he hadn't explained it properly. He thought she'd be too scared if he told her the details, but it was good that his defense worked. He stroked the girl's head again, and she lowered it in surprise. The girl said she heard her father's voice. Asha tried to connect her thoughts to say what she was feeling, but the tears came to her eyes faster and faster. She soon gave in to her emotions and burst into tears in front of Kilt's, who immediately hugged the girl. Our heroine at that moment understood that her father would never come for her, especially so far away. He would never calm her down or stroke her, and yet she still hoped to see him. After some time, the girl had somewhat recovered. She was ashamed. Kilt's, however, was by her side the entire time, helping with her runny nose and tears. Soon the girl announced that she was sleepy and had no energy. Kilt's looked at her in surprise. After that, he immediately wrapped her in a blanket and picked her up. Now they could return to the cart. By the way, the morning was very bright. Asha couldn't understand where the sun's rays came from if it had rained recently. At that moment, Kilt's said that everything was fine. Because there were no more mirror spirits here, she could sleep peacefully. The girl asked who he was talking about, to which the boy replied that that was the name of the creature. They whisper to people what they most want to hear. In that case, the girl asked Kilt's what he had heard. The boy asked what she was talking about. The girl asked what he had heard from the mirror spirit. Immediately, the silhouette of a fair-haired girl appeared in front of his face and addressed him. He soon came to his senses and said he hadn't heard anything. Everything was fine. However, his gaze immediately changed. He looked down in disappointment. Asha watched his emotions, and at some point, she began to think that he was lying. She would really like to know who he was thinking about when he met the mirror spirit, but unfortunately, sleep was overwhelming her, so now was not the time to think about it. Kilt's picked her up and carried her to the cart. Zamrin Nagordlak Reitza. Our heroine desperately tried to read the names of the cities. Kilt's laughed and said she read everything backwards. He'd have to teach her to write. Asha soon glanced at the map and said the continent resembled a dragon. The wizard said the ancients believed the same, which is how the myth of the giant dragon originated. Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment and asked what this myth was. Kilt's replied that it was quite well known. One day, a giant dragon saw a golden bird in the sky, which he immediately chased, but never realized until the end of his life that he was not destined to catch it. This story became a legend about the continent's origins. Asha, perplexed, asked if such dragons really existed. Kilt's immediately replied that the legend was very old. The boy added that while dragons existed, they weren't that big, so the girl asked what they were like. The boy glanced ahead and said they were probably the size of this lake. Our heroine happily raised her head, expressing her even greater curiosity. Incidentally, she decided to ask where their house was located on the map. At that very moment, the guy saw in Asha's smile, the very smile that made his heart skip a beat. It froze in the same way now, so he couldn't immediately say where and what. Soon the guy came to his senses and started pointing his finger at the map, saying that it wasn't very far left. Looking at a piece of land that looked like a dragon's wing, Asha asked if that was their home. Kilt's said yes. The girl then asked if there was anything special there. The boy thought for a moment and then said there was nothing special there. In that case, she asked in surprise why they needed to go there. Kilt's didn't know what to answer to this question. After some silence, the guy finally said that it was indeed too difficult a question. Our heroine smiled and happily asked if he would be glad to return there. Kilt's smiled back and said that was correct, that was the reason. In any case, it was already getting dark, so it was time to return to the hotel. The girl said she'd like to swim in the lake tomorrow. The action takes us closer to the Mountain Pearl Hotel. Our heroes were heading there. Meanwhile, something strange was happening near her. A whole crowd of people was standing around the cart. Because of this carriage, it was impossible to get inside the hotel, so a crowd of people piled on it to turn it over. Kilt's knew it would likely be a long time, and he had hoped for quiet when he chose this location. At that moment, our heroine noticed that the wizard next to her was whispering something to himself, so she stared at him in surprise. At that very moment, everyone noticed that the carriage began to glow, and soon turned over. The boys pushing the carriage were surprised, as for a second it seemed as light as a feather. Meanwhile, our heroes rushed to the hotel. As soon as they entered, Asha immediately turned to Kilt's. He asked her what she wanted to ask. The girl stopped and asked him how long he had been studying magic. Kilt's looked at her in surprise. He was of course surprised by this question, but decided to answer by saying that he had studied magic for 10,000 nights. The girl lowered her head in bewilderment and began to try to count on her fingers how much it was. Soon they sat down on the veranda. Asha, shocked, laid her head on the table, telling Kiltz that she envied him. Suddenly, an unfamiliar girl approached them, apologized for disturbing them a little, but asked to chat a little. Kiltz immediately said that he did not like this, so he declined her offer and asked her to leave. However, the girl remained where she was and assumed that she would not be mistaken if she said that it was they who helped them. Kiltz still wasn't buying it, so he said he had no idea what she was talking about. The girl replied that her father-in-law was also a wizard, so she understood everything immediately. Our heroine incidentally noticed that this was the carriage's owner. Nevertheless, the girl thanked the man for helping as no one was hurt. Even the most powerful Astir sorcerers can't use magic without tools. She was very curious about his education and even wanted to thank him somehow. Although she couldn't offer much, her words were sincere. She suggested lunch. Kiltz, in turn, refused, saying that he had done nothing to deserve such generosity. At that moment, an awkward silence hung between them, and the girl didn't even know what to say. At that moment, she looked at Asha and asked the little lady if she was this wizard's apprentice. Kiltz intervened and said that she was his niece, and he was keeping an eye on her due to certain circumstances. Her questions were already beyond the bounds of propriety, so he asked her to leave. The girl apologized, saying that the little lady was the same age as her child. In any case, she wished them fond memories on their journey. Our heroine was very surprised after hearing about the child, so she became curious about who they were talking about. At that moment, a red-haired man peeked out from behind the woman's skirt. The man immediately began waving his hand. Soon he approached the girl and whispered in her ear that next year he was entering Yafranger and would also become a wizard. Immediately after these words, he turned around and followed his mother, who was already approaching the exit. Kiltz sighed, saying they were disgusting, and our heroine asked him in surprise what a Yafranger was. The wizard asked if she was talking about what the guy had said. She immediately nodded her head. He soon revealed that Yafranger was an educational institution in Astier. Simply put, a school of magic. The nobles of that country sent their children there. Asha asked in surprise if children could really become magicians without 10,000 nights like Kiltz. The guy replied that it would be hard to call it real magic, but it was true. Our heroine sighed heavily, saying that this boy would be going there next year. It must be very interesting. After that, she turned her gaze to Kiltz and asked if he had fun learning magic. Without thinking twice, Kiltz said he hadn't had the slightest bit of fun learning this, not even for a moment. The next day, we find ourselves in a clothing store. Asha was saying she'd never worn dresses like this before. The girl assumed that it didn't suit her very well, but all the consultants were perplexed and said that it looked great on her and she could be sure of that. They all looked at her with admiration and said that she looked just like a doll, and also that she had very beautiful blonde hair. The girl said that many people come on vacation now, so they prepared so many outfits in advance. For example, this lace was specially flown here from Astier. Asha only thought it looked great, but something so expensive probably doesn't suit her. However, the consultants grabbed the girl by the hand again and pulled her towards other dresses showing different fabrics. They started to lead her around the entire establishment, showing her everything they had. After some time, they put a pink dress on her, which seemed to look even better. The crowd of consultants began choosing the next outfit options, while Asha stayed nearby and helped her tie her dress. At that moment, she asked the girl why she had such short hair, because with long hair, she would become even more beautiful. Our heroine wanted to say something about her father, but at that moment, a joyful child's cry was heard behind her, addressed to her dad. The little girl ran to her dad, telling him how beautiful the dress she was wearing was. The man agreed and decided to buy it. The girl was very happy about this, and her dad said that if their beloved little lady wanted such a dress, then he would be only too happy to buy it. Asha, of course, couldn't help but hide her envy, because she had never experienced anything like this. At that moment, a consultant approached her, asking which outfit she liked best. She responded with surprise, saying she didn't even know which was best. Suddenly, the shop door opened, and inside was Kiltz, who was staring intently at the girl. The girl looked at him shyly, unsure what to say. Could it be that he didn't like it? At that moment, he went to the consultants, while simultaneously saying that the dress looked good. After some time, our heroine was finally able to escape from this nightmare. She sighed heavily, thinking that her daddy had never given her anything even close to this. Asha still couldn't understand why he was so kind, because they weren't even close. In turn, Kiltz bought all the dresses that both he and Asha had their eye on. She could never have imagined that there would be someone who would value her so much. At that moment, Kiltz came out to her. The guy asked in surprise if something had happened. The girl laughed and said that everything was fine, so he didn't have to worry. After a while, our heroes went back to their room. Asha suddenly turned to Kiltz. The girl looking at the floor asked him if he wanted to be her daddy. At that moment, Kiltz almost fell over. The guy raised his head in bewilderment and asked Asha what she had just said. The girl was very scared, saying that she just thought that. Kiltz, however, interrupted her, saying that he did not mean to scare her and that he was not angry with her. Either way, the mood was ruined for both of them. The boy glanced guiltily at the girl, but soon they were on their way again. As he passed shops along the way, the guy kept peering into the windows and asking Asha if she wanted anything, jewelry or maybe a bag. The answer was the same, no. Our heroine walked and thought about how she couldn't even imagine all the luxury jewelry and so on, so it was hard for her to even look at it. However, at that moment, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, so she stopped. The girl stared at one point with delight, and Kiltz asked in bewilderment what had happened. However, she in turn pressed herself against the display case and could not even say a word. Kiltz, looking at the doll, said it was automatic. It repeated several magically programmed movements. He supposed it was quite good for its size. Asha turned around in confusion and asked if this was magic too. The guy replied that it wasn't quite that, more like a magical device. In any case, he asked if she wanted one. There was no doubt that the girl wanted it, but it was very expensive, which didn't really allow her to say yes. Asha sighed and said she didn't want to. However, Kiltz stood his ground, saying they could buy her if they wanted. The girl looked at Kiltz with surprise and joy at the same time, and said that if so, then she really wants her. After a while, the action takes us to evening. Asha was sitting with her new doll, admiring her. Of course, at that moment, they were on the shore of the lake, just like yesterday's. Suddenly, Kiltz broke the silence, asking the girl if she wanted to return to her father. However, there was no response from the girl. The boy immediately said that he had bought her with money and had no excuses. That's why he wanted and still wants to give her everything he can. Asha started saying she didn't need it. The guy smiled and, patting her head, asked her to be a little more honest. He hoped he could spoil her at least a little. Looking at her with the same sincere smile, he asked her to tell him only the truth, because he would buy her anything and listen to any whims. The girl smiled back and said that she liked everything very much anyway. And it was true. Asha suddenly asked if she could sit on his lap. Kiltz was surprised, but said she could. The girl was just about to get up when Kiltz suddenly felt someone approaching, so he instantly turned around, covering the girl with his body. The man who approached them scratched his beard in surprise, saying that he had never thought about such a meeting. The man smiled and said that, as he approached them, he hoped they were the ones. In any case, he hadn't expected to meet them in the village of Corinthia. The boy stared at the man in surprise and asked what he was doing there. The man in turn asked him not to be so rude. He replied that it was just a fun family trip. His wife wanted to go north. By the way, shouldn't he grant her wish too? Still, Kiltz was wary of these words, so he asked in surprise if they were really traveling through an ordinary village. The man stared at the wizard, saying he was still as sharp-tongued as ever. His tone didn't change at all. At that moment, he discovered that Kiltz was there with a companion. Realizing he was talking about our heroine, she tensed up. Of course, the guy wasn't going to let anyone hurt the girl, so he told the annoying old man that it was none of his business. In turn, the man smiled and asked if he really wouldn't even allow himself to be introduced. Looking at the wizard, he said that he hoped that Kiltz had not forgotten noble etiquette during this time. At that moment, our heroine looked out in surprise to see what was happening and who this grandfather was. Suddenly, the man's face changed. She began screaming in confusion, asking who it was. Turning her gaze to Kiltz, he asked if he had really done what he thought he had. Hearing no answer, he became thoughtful, saying that whatever it was simply amazing. The man asked her name. Hearing no answer, he asked her to tell him, but Kiltz remained silent. Asha, meanwhile, was thinking that the man was kind, but unexpectedly for herself, she began to feel a strange feeling. Kiltz addressed Count Kazuyu, saying it was impolite to talk about etiquette. The man asked what was wrong, as he wasn't there just for him. He immediately asked the girl to come to him. The man smiled and began reaching his hands toward the girl. Naturally, she was very scared, so she started telling Kiltz about it. The boy grabbed his hand and told him not to even think about touching it. Otherwise, he would teach him the etiquette he held so dear. Seeing no reaction, Kiltz suggested he should see how far he could twist his arm. Kaizuyu tensed, saying that such behavior was far from noble. Kiltz squeezed the Count's hand sharply, and the Count, perplexed, told the wizard that his nature hadn't changed. The boy in turn replied that he too was still as selfish as ever. Our heroine watched all this in bewilderment, not believing that Kiltz could actually break his arm. However, the girl turned to him to ask him not to do this. Count Kaizuyu seized the opportunity and immediately jumped aside. He laughed, saying that this reunion was too touching. The young man in turn asked not to call him that. The Count replied that addressing someone by their first name was a sign of friendliness. Soon after these words, the man nevertheless headed in the other direction, still saying that they would see each other soon. Kiltz immediately looked at the girl and asked for forgiveness, but our heroine said that everything was fine. The girl asked who the man was, but heard a sigh and a warning that it was best not to think about it. She was undoubtedly very surprised and thoughtful. Asha wasn't stupid enough to not guess that this man knew something about her. In any case, it was time to go back. After some time, the action takes us to the city, and the day of unexpected meetings was not over. A strange guy with a scar on his face greeted Iskadion, saying that he thought he was somewhere at the end of the world, and did not know that he was exploring the continent. Kiltz just sighed heavily, because he didn't expect to meet Altman here either. At this moment, Count Altman approached again, glad that they had already met. As he said, the reunion yesterday was wonderful. He personally allowed the Ivory Tower alumni to meet. Kaizuyu asked Kiltz how he was feeling. However, the guy replied that they had never been close friends. Altman laughed and apologized to Iskadion. The guy also said that, to tell the truth, he missed him a lot. Kaizuyu smiled and told the boys that they looked alike. He also offered to take the girl. Our hero said it was foolish to think he'd let the girl go. The Count laughed and said it didn't matter. Count Kaizuyu took out his watch, saying that everyone had heard that the Kaizuyu family always gets what they want. Kiltz looked at him in bewilderment, saying that their kind still didn't have an ounce of dignity. The guy asked if the cane was by any chance a relic of Igaron's. He'd paid for lying to the authorities and wandered like a wolf. The man smiled and said he'd even begged the man. Kiltz suggested that he was going to fight him with only a piece of magic stolen from the dragon. Count Kaizuyu said that everything was correct and that he couldn't do it alone, but Altman also wants to tear Kiltz to pieces, so he couldn't help but call him. The guy immediately put Asha on the ground and told her she should go home for now. When she arrived, she would be met, and they would need to tell him he sent her. Our heroine looked at him in surprise and asked how he was. The guy replied that he would follow her. The girl still wanted to ask something before leaving, but at that very moment, blood splashed in her direction. The action takes us forward a bit. A guy was standing over a girl trying to ask her something. Asha finally started to come to her senses, so the guy asked if she was okay. Without waiting for her answer, he still extended his hand to help her up. However, our heroine did not understand what was happening and where she was, because she was sure that Kiltz had followed her. One way or another, she needed to figure out what to do now. She extended her hand to the guy who asked again if she was okay. Asha finally responded, saying she was relatively okay. Taking the girl's hand, the guy thought about something, and soon their hands began to glow. Our heroine looked at the boy in surprise and asked where Kiltz was. A stupid question, perhaps? The guy, however, continued to do his job and soon said that Kiltz had not yet arrived. The girl asked when he would return, to which the boy said that he should return soon. Asha scratched her head and said she understood. She still felt awkward talking to her peers. At that moment, the guy looked at her and asked how their trip had gone. Our heroine paused. Could it really be a trip across the prairie? However, the question could have been about her vacation. The girl thought for a moment and said it had been interesting. The guy smiled and said he was very glad about that. In any case, it was time to go since the old man was waiting for them. Our heroine asked who they were talking about. The guy in turn asked him not to ask unnecessary questions. The girl apologized, but soon asked if he really knew who she was. Without a doubt, he said he knew, turning his head. He told her that she was a star. Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment and asked again in bewilderment because she did not understand what this meant. However, there was no answer. The boy merely smiled mysteriously and continued walking forward. After some time, they approached a house on the door of which the guy knocked a certain number of times. Our heroine, looking at this building, asked in surprise where they were. The boy said it was a wooden house. At that very moment, a puzzled old man emerged from the house, asking who dared knock on his door. Asha shyly started saying that her name was Asha Konak, and that Kiltz had sent her here. The old man's eyes widened as he heard the girl's name. How could Kiltz have thought of that? The old man, perplexed, began to mutter something of his own, so Asha decided they had come to the wrong place. The old man shouted, asking Kiltz how he dared trust him with a child. A moment later, he approached her as close as possible. Our heroine was very surprised by this, so she asked him to step back. The man, in fact, did just that. He walked inside, perplexed, muttering under his breath about why they were in the north. Our heroine now couldn't understand what was happening, or whether she could enter. After all, she hadn't heard his permission. But was she really supposed to stand here all night? At that moment, the bewildered old man shouted and asked why she wasn't coming in. Was she really planning to stay with the forest beetles? Once inside the house, the man handed the girl some milk. She of course understood that now was probably not the right time to drink milk. Soon, Asha spoke up, saying she didn't know where to begin, but she thought Kiltz was in danger. The man replied that he had a theory. Perhaps Kaizuyu and Altman were watching him, and then an argument broke out, and they fought? In that case, there's no need to worry. He sent her here so she wouldn't have to witness the violence. Our heroine asked in surprise if Kiltz was really that strong. The old man laughed and said the boy was strong, and compared to him, the other two were like little children. Asha even shuddered at these words. In any case, she decided to ask the old man if he really was Kiltz's teacher. The man laughed, saying he was already crumbling, so he was no match for a teacher, especially since he couldn't even use magic. Our heroine looked at him in surprise and asked if he really couldn't use magic. He replied that he had once been able to, so he could show her what little he had. Asha didn't know what to expect, so she watched carefully as the old man's hand reached for his eye. A moment later, her face changed to one of shock because the old man had done something incredible. He found an eye in his hand, which he pulled out. Asha immediately began screaming. The old man laughed and said it was a magical instrument. It was as if a magical eye had been implanted into his body. The girl asked in surprise. He explained that other people thought it was innate because they had never encountered anything like it. Anyway, he said it was late, so it was time to sleep. They had one spare room. The guy immediately intervened and said it was dirty and therefore impossible to sleep there. The old man, perplexed, asked how this could happen if he'd asked him to clean up the mess. The boy drank his milk and told the old man that he'd asked him not to shout. He said he was going to get some sleep, so he asked not to be disturbed until he woke up. The old man still said he had to clean up there. The boy replied that he hadn't received such an order. The man sighed and said that all these guys knew was talk. In that case, Asha would sleep in Pram's room. Finally, he asked him to make sure he cleaned the room tomorrow. The boy approached the girl and said they needed to go. His room was on the second floor. In any case, the guy grabbed her hand and pulled her along. All Asha managed to do was wish the old man good night. The man in turn muttered something to himself. For example, that they were very similar. He didn't understand what Kiltz was thinking about, and our heroine in turn didn't understand what this man was talking about. In any case, within a couple of minutes, they were in the room. Pram approached the girl and handed her her pajamas. The girl immediately put on her pajamas, but that was not all Pram wanted to do. At some point, the guy pounced on her and started rubbing her with a towel. Asha didn't understand what was happening, but as it turned out, the guy simply wiped away the blood. As soon as he did this, he turned to the girl and asked if she was okay. Our heroine smiled and touched his hand, saying that everything was fine. Just before bed, Pram asked him if he should turn off the light, to which the girl replied that it was scary. The boy smiled and said he'd leave the light on. Having wished each other good night, the boys turned in different directions. After a while, our heroine got up because she simply couldn't sleep. Her doll was broken, and she was worried about it. Opening the window, the girl wondered if Kiltz could fix it if she asked him. However, he wasn't here. Soon, looking out the window, she realized she missed him. She stared out for a long time, but Kiltz never returned. The action takes us to the next morning, when the girl finally woke up. She was surprised to find Pram already gone. Asha noticed only her mechanical doll next to her. Unfortunately, it no longer worked. After some time, our heroine left the room and the smells from below simply fascinated her. As it turned out, the reason for this was Prom, who had been preparing delicious food since early morning. Our heroine wished them good morning and asked if they had slept well. The man said they were fine, and then gestured to a chair, asking them to sit down. The girl immediately asked about kilts, but the old man said it hadn't arrived yet. Asha, by the way, couldn't figure out what kind of big book it was, or how the old man read it. Just then, Prom told the old man not to read the newspaper while he ate. The girl asked what it was, and the boy replied that it was a collection of everything that had happened in the world printed on paper. The man was very surprised at this moment because he couldn't believe she didn't know about newspapers. He asked how she grew up. He immediately handed her the newspaper so that she could read it a little and get acquainted with it. However, as soon as she picked up the newspaper, countless letters appeared before her that she could not put together. The man looked at the girl in bewilderment, thinking this would all be difficult. He immediately asked if she couldn't read. The girl looked away, embarrassed, and said that was true. She was still incredibly embarrassed, but what could she do? While Pram was eating, he noticed that the girl was not particularly comfortable, so he decided that she needed help. The guy approached Asha and said he'd help her quickly learn her letters. Our heroine, surprised, asked if it was true. Pram immediately began telling her what she needed to know. Meanwhile, the old man was thinking about how this house had turned into a kindergarten in just one day. In any case, he asked the children to stop chatting and eat better. Our heroine took the plate and said there was a lot of it, and in response, she heard that she was thin, so she needed it. After a while, the action takes us to the forest where the girl came. She suggested that she should have gone with Prom. However, the guy disappeared as soon as he finished eating. Our heroine also ate and said she wanted to go for a walk. At this moment, our heroine was pleasantly surprised, because while she was walking in an unknown direction, she reached a huge greenhouse. The girl came closer to look inside, and as soon as she did, she was surprised at how beautiful it was. She had heard that glass was very expensive, and here all the walls were made of it, just think. Suddenly, she noticed someone inside. As it turned out, it was Pram, who, by the way, also noticed the uninvited guest. After a while, the girl was inside, and the guy was giving her a tour. He told her about the different plants she liked. Looking at the prickly plant, she asked what it was. Pram replied that it was a cactus, a southern plant that grows only on the Waxing Moon Peninsula. Our heroine roughly recalled the map and realized it was very far away. Asha wondered how he ended up here. The guy immediately replied that he was raised with magic. He also added that anything can be done with magic. Our heroine couldn't argue with that. Absolutely true. Growing southern plants in the north for magic is a piece of cake given the power of kilts. Our heroine immediately fell silent for some unknown reason and didn't look particularly happy. Prum asked if she was sad, to which she nodded. The girl asked him if he knew kilts. The guy said he did. He shows up here sometimes and then leaves right away. Asha admitted she was very nervous, even though her grandfather had told her not to worry. Pram looked at her in surprise and asked why. The girl explained that the reason for her worries was that he was wounded during the battle. Pram thought for a moment and said that everything here was his creation, even this garden. The girl asked if they could create something similar with magic. The boy thought for a moment, then shook his head, saying that only kilts could do such a thing. Our heroine decided he truly was a great wizard. By the way, at that moment, the girl also realized that Pram was trying to calm her down. She immediately began thanking him for his support and asked him to tell kilts it was nice here. Pram nodded and then invited her to sit down and rest. Our heroine immediately headed to the table, and as soon as she sat down, she pulled her doll out of her pocket. Pram noticed this and asked if he understood correctly that this doll was her friend. The girl looked at it and said that Kilts had bought it, but unfortunately, it broke on the way here. It would be great if it could be fixed. Pram thought for a moment and soon asked to give him the doll. For a second, he wanted to look at it. After a quick inspection, the guy said the spell was fine. The blow had simply caused her to run out of mana. He needed to infuse it, and the doll would work. Our heroine asked in surprise what mana was. Pram told her it was a substance necessary for using magic. Asha then asked where she could get it. The guy raised his hand and replied that she could take it right here. It was everywhere. Our heroine still replied that she didn't see anything, to which the guy said that she could only be felt. Soon he asked her to close her eyes. Asha was very intrigued, so she did as he told her. And yet, after a couple of seconds, the girl opened her eyes, realizing that she felt nothing. Pram thought for a moment and after a few seconds, he extended his hand, telling her to take it. Asha extended her hand, and as soon as Pram took her hand, he said that she would feel mana through him. The girl tried her best, and at one point even decided he was making fun of her because it didn't seem like what she wanted at all. As expected, nothing happened. However, at that very moment, something incredible happened because their hands began to glow. The girl immediately jumped up, waving her arms. Asha, confused, asked what that just was, to which Pram replied that it was mana. The girl immediately began excitedly asking if she could fix the doll simply by pouring mana into it. Would she be able to do it? The guy said that he didn't know for sure about one of them, so he would help her. Our heroine picked up the doll and began to concentrate. Soon she began to feel a strange surge of energy. A moment later, she opened her eyes, and to her surprise, the doll came to life again. Asha threw herself at Pram, with hugs telling him the doll was working again. She immediately ran to her grandfather. A moment later, she ran into the house, starting to scream and call for her grandfather, who was just cleaning. He, perplexed, told her not to run around here with dirty feet, and the girl, without even catching her breath, began to say that she was able to fix the doll. The man, however, did not understand what she was talking about, so he asked her to catch her breath and then talk to him. Our heroine immediately handed over the living doll, saying that she had fixed it. Taking it in his hands, the man asked in surprise if it was automatic. He didn't know if children played with things like that these days. At that moment, Pram, who was standing behind her, said that she had repaired the doll herself by pouring her mana into it. The man knelt down in confusion, asking the girl if Kiltz had taught her this. Asha replied that he hadn't, so he asked how she had managed to do it. The girl began to speak shyly about how Pram had helped her, because otherwise she wouldn't have succeeded. Looking at her angry grandfather, the girl asked with fear if she had done something wrong. She simply couldn't find a place for herself in her thoughts, because she didn't know what to do. Nevertheless, the old man laughed and, patting Asha on the head, said she was doing well. She'd learned to work with mana. Children with such talent are rare. He also said that when Kiltz arrived, she should ask him to teach her witchcraft. He would tell her everything in order. Our heroine asked, surprised. The man explained that Kiltz was Kaldrojan's court wizard. He had many students, even though teaching someone was hard work. The girl, surprised, asked again. The man explained that a court wizard is a mage who reports directly to the ruler. Asha wondered if Kiltz found out what she'd done. Would he praise her the way her grandfather had? She really hoped so. The action shifts to a week later. Meanwhile, our heroine was walking down the street when she suddenly spotted Kiltz. Without thinking twice, she ran to him with hugs, as she had been waiting for this meeting for a very long time. Of course, the wizard was also glad to see her, so with a smile on his face, he asked if she was doing well. Asha said everything was fine, and then asked if he was hurt. He said she was only hurting his pride by looking at him like that. Soon after, he stood up and asked where Haskan was. Asha, surprised, asked again, and said that if he was talking about Grandpa, then he was here. At that very moment, he ran out into the street and began waving his stick, trying to hit Kiltz, who at that time was dodging the blows. The wizard glanced at Haskan and said that if he was so active now, he shouldn't complain about a sore back later. Haskan was outraged that he had been gone for so long, and he was the first to hear it. Kiltz glanced at him and asked if greeting people with fists was really fashionable in Corinthia. These days, Haskan told him not to change the subject. How did he even do that? Pointing his finger at the girl, the man said that he had found a girl exactly like her. Asha immediately considered these words, because if you think about it, Count Kazuyu had said the same thing, so the girl immediately asked who she resembled. Kiltz looked down guiltily and said that now was not the time to talk about it, so he would tell her everything later. After that, he came up to her and, taking her in his arms, said that it was time for them to go inside. Our heroine looked at him in surprise, wondering why he couldn't answer her question. She wanted to ask him so many things, but unfortunately, she simply didn't have the opportunity. Better to do it later. The action takes us to the next morning. The boys are just getting ready for breakfast. By this time, Kiltz, who had just unpacked all his things, began to come down to them. Approaching the table, Haskan looked at the boy and asked if he would eat with them. He turned his head towards Asha, who with all her appearance begged him to sit with them. The boy happily said he'd eat with them and began to sit down at the table. However, Haskan was against it. Soon they began to eat, but our heroine interrupted him and said that she would like to show him something. After he nodded his head, Asha, without thinking twice, took out her doll and showed it. Kiltz was surprised she kept it. Did she really like the doll that much? The girl smiled happily and said she really liked it. However, at that moment, she also said that this doll was broken, so the girl thought, trying to remember the word mana, or whatever they call it, she poured it into the doll and fixed it. Kiltz certainly didn't expect to hear those words, so he immediately squeezed the doll, telling the girl that she shouldn't have done that. The guy said he would fix it himself next time, and that was not all he could do. Looking at the girl, he said that he would buy her everything she wanted, so there was no need to use magic again. After this conversation, there was a dead silence at the table, as well as an awkward atmosphere. After some time, our heroine was lying in her bed and couldn't understand why everyone was using magic, but she couldn't. The child she met at Lake Arendonpram and Kiltz. They all know how to use magic. Even her grandfather said that she has talent too. Just at that moment, Prom came into the girl's room, worried that she had left so abruptly. Approaching the girl, he asked how she was feeling, but Asha was lying under the blanket, all in tears. She attacked Pram with hugs, saying she didn't know what she'd done wrong. The guy replied that she hadn't done anything wrong. He wiped the tears from the girl's face and said that Kiltz wasn't angry with her. He was just scared. Asha, surprised, asked what that meant. The guy explained that she would find out about it later. The girl asked if she really needed to know anything. Nevertheless, Pram hugged her silently and said nothing more. Our heroine paused, but thanked him for his support nonetheless. The girl decided to ask Kiltz again, so she left the room. At that moment, Hazkan asked Kiltz if he had killed him. The guy replied that he couldn't spare him, so he made him suffer eternal pain, so he wouldn't die soon. Hazkan suggested that Kazuyu must be ill too, as he'd said that Egeron's relic had brought something strange. Kiltz replied that he'd been looking for it, but it looked more like a toy. After a short silence, Kiltz decided to ask how Asha learned to control mana. Hazkan, surprised, said he didn't know either, since she'd done it herself. She'd wanted to fix the doll or something. Kiltz asked if he was sure he hadn't taught her magic. The man turned to the wizard and asked him to tell him where he'd found a child like her. Hazkan said he even thought Kiltz did it. The guy in turn slammed the table, saying he couldn't say everything. The man asked the wizard if he and the man were related anyway, and again, silence. Hazkan added that he could buy a new doll without even needing to use magic, since it seemed she could fix it herself. The guy replied that she didn't need to know about magic. He didn't care how talented she was. He wasn't going to teach her. She simply didn't know anything. Asha had been listening to their conversation the whole time, so she was very surprised. Hazkan asked in bewilderment if Kiltz really wanted her to spend the rest of her life living in the mountains and playing with toys without knowing how the outside world works and without friends. Kiltz in turn said that the outside world was terrible, so she didn't need to know about it. Hakan asked him if the wizard thought the same thing. With a heavy sigh, the guy said that he didn't know how different the world she lived in was from hell. Hazkan immediately jumped up, trying to hit Kiltz on the head, saying it was not his place to judge. However, the boy dodged. With a heavy sigh, the man asked again where he'd found her. Kiltz replied that he'd found her in the northern part of Nurmaz. A retired mercenary was with her. Hazkan sighed again, saying that it was a village, so he wasn't surprised that he didn't even know its name. However, he noted that Asha was very intelligent, meaning Kiltz could become her teacher. The boy again reminded her that he had no intention of teaching her magic, so he declined. Hazkan no longer knew how to react, but he still asked again if he really intended to raise her like this. Without thinking twice, he nodded his head. The man asked what he meant. Was he going to adopt her? Kiltz, perplexed, asked if he really had to submit to the system. Hazkan slammed the table and called him an idiot. Even Jay said that when she grows up, she'll go to school and learn a lot. The wizard, nevertheless, said that teachers are better than ivory mages. Hazkan, in turn, said he was talking about friends, and perhaps someone more than just a friend. Hazkan wanted to know what he was so proudly agreeing to. Even when that time came, he wouldn't be able to spend it smiling as if nothing had happened. Kiltz, perplexed, asked if the old man was really hinting at her as his lover. The man, surprised, asked if he hadn't brought her with that intention. At that very moment, a loud bang was heard, causing our heroine to look out from around the corner in surprise. The Hazkan chair was lying on the floor, and he himself was hanging in the air in front of Kiltz. It wasn't hard to guess that the reason for this was that Kiltz had lifted him up, saying that the old man should know when to joke and when not to. Hazkan nevertheless snorted, telling the wizard that he was still a brat. At that moment, our heroine let out a terrifying squeak, causing Kiltz to sharply turn his head. The guy's face changed in an instant, and the first thing he asked was how long she had been standing there. The girl immediately paused. Should she run away? She sheepishly began to say that she hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Hazkan nevertheless smiled and waved his hand, saying there was nothing to fear. This guy was terminally ill. He would die if he spoke a kind word. Kiltz, without thinking twice, let the old man go and went to Asha to try to establish contact. The boy extended his hand and apologized and asked if he could talk to her. After a while, the three of them were sitting at the table, but for the first couple of minutes, there was dead silence. Kiltz finally broke the silence by asking the girl how much she had heard. She thought for a moment and soon said she'd heard their conversation starting with the murder story. Kiltz's expression changed even more, and he said he understood. The girl approached him and asked how much money was needed to learn how to use magic. The guy said that wasn't true. In that case, she asked even if he didn't have much money, he could still teach her, right? She jumped up and said she really wanted to learn magic. She would work hard and pay for the training. She wasn't making any money now, but she would start later. Kiltz sighed heavily and told the girl that tuition fees were definitely not a problem. Asha then said that if money wasn't an issue, she would cook and clean the house. However, the guy said he wouldn't force her to do it. Then the girl said she would do whatever Kiltz asked. Would he be able to teach her even the basics? But the wizard still began to say the problem lay elsewhere. Asha practically climbed onto the table, starting to talk about how she would do everything. Study work, help do homework, everything. But Kiltz still stopped her. Hazkan soon intervened, saying that at this rate the whole night could pass. Kiltz looked at the girl and asked if she really wanted to learn this. She proudly and confidently said that she really wants to learn this, it's her dream, and she wants to make it come true. And again, that same girl who had been in his head appeared before Kiltz's eyes. Sighing, the wizard said he agreed, since he'd already promised to fulfill any of her requests. There was no point in taking it back now. The guy reluctantly said that he would teach her magic if she wanted it so much. After a while, the girl was in her room, but she couldn't sleep. At this rate, it was even starting to get light. Realizing that Asha couldn't sleep at all, she got out of bed, put on warm socks, and went. Meanwhile, Kiltz was in the kitchen, drinking coffee, and was surprised that the girl had woken up so early. Asha approached in surprise and asked what smelled so delicious. The guy replied that it was roasted ground coffee, dissolved in boiling water. Showing him the cup, he said coffee was hard to find in the north, but Pram had somehow managed to get it. Asha glanced at the substance and declared it black as tar. The girl picked up the cup to taste the coffee, but a moment later, her face twisted. She said it was too bitter. Kiltz took it and said that's how it should be, and Asha decided that coffee was definitely not her thing. In any case, she asked when their classes would start. Maybe now? The wizard sat down on a chair and said that they should not hurry because the sun had not even risen yet. He sat her down on a chair and asked her to wait, and the girl sighed heavily because she had hoped that she would begin training immediately. At that moment, she remembered how she had asked her father to send her to school, but he in turn had rejected her request and said that they did not have money for such nonsense. She knew she'd been waiting for this day for a long time, but fortunately, it had finally arrived. As soon as the sun rose, Kiltz called her to him. After some time, they were sitting in the field, and our heroine looked attentively and joyfully at the wizard. Kiltz was even a little surprised, because he had never seen her so happy. At that moment, he sat down on a stump opposite her and asked if she knew why winter was coming. Asha was surprised by this question, thinking they were going to learn magic. The girl replied that it was because it was getting cold. The mage then asked why she was getting cold. She immediately paused, expressing her unsureness of the answer. Kiltz suddenly asked the next question. Had she ever wondered why trees, mosses, grass could grow on this land? The girl knew the answer to this question. She replied that it was because soil consists of substances that help plants grow. Kiltz then asked the following question. Why are these substances in the ground? Once again, the girl felt as if she were at a dead end. How could she know this? And moreover, why did she need to know all this? At that moment, Kiltz tucked his hair behind his ear and asked them to watch him closely. He extended his hand toward the grass. At that very moment, his hand, just like the grass, began to glow. Our heroine looked at all this with incredible delight, and the last thing that surprised her was that a living flower appeared out of nowhere. The girl continued to stare at this miracle in bewilderment, realizing that the flower hadn't been there. It had only just bloomed. The guy suddenly asked if she remembered what he had just done. Asha shook her head and asked how he had done it. The boy explained that he channeled some of his mana into the earth. It was enough to turn a seed into a sprout. She said that plants grow thanks to the substances in the earth, and that was true. Kiltz added that speaking in mage language mana gives life to these sprouts. The girl immediately assumed that mana gives birth to life. The wizard in turn continued to talk about how mana exists everywhere. She said she first saw magic in the pasture, when in fact she'd been surrounded by it her entire life. The changing of the seasons, the movement of the stars, the ripening of the harvest, the laying of eggs by robins, the smell of fresh bread, the howling of a wolf. All these phenomena are created by the flow of mana. He summed it all up by saying that all of this is magical power, the power that makes everything possible, the source of life, the breath of the last dragon on earth. The guy said that a magician is someone who has an innate talent to sense and use mana. By these words, he meant that she should learn magic and not just learn to use it. However, since she has taken it upon herself, and he is on her side, it is his duty as a magician to guide her on the right path. Looking down, he said that from today on, he would teach her magic. The girl was incredibly happy to hear these words every time Kiltz said them. By the way, before they started, the guy said that she should give him several promises. The girl screamed in bewilderment, saying that if he wanted her to sell her soul, then she would. Kiltz sighed and said that there was no need. First, he asked Asha to never use magic to harm anyone. Giving a thumbs up, she said that she would never, and had no intention of harming good people or animals. Secondly, the magician asked to use magic only when necessary. Asha looked at Kiltz in surprise and asked how she knew when she needed to use magic. The boy replied that she had to figure it out for herself. And the girl immediately remembered that she had never seen him use magic without reason. The girl promised to do that too. Finally, the guy said that she should never try to resurrect the dead. At that moment, silence fell. Although this request was very surprising, the girl said that she promised not to harm anyone and not to revive anyone. In that case, from now on, she becomes the apprentice of Iskadian, the descendant of the Grey Wanderer. Until the bones of the moon appear beneath the starry sea, she will remain his apprentice. At that moment, he asked Asha to extend her hand. Of course, without thinking twice, she extended her hand. The guy touched her hand. A moment later, she began waving her arms in surprise. Feeling a strange sensation, Kiltz explained that this spell would allow her to use mana. It will disappear in about a day, so she will need to renew it every day if she wants to continue using magic. However, it was time to put the lectures aside. Today's lesson needed to begin. The girl was incredibly excited, so she couldn't hide her emotions. At some point, she decided she shouldn't act like a child. Kiltz, in turn, showed her the mana stone that was part of the lanterns they used. It looks like an ordinary stone on the outside, but it glows when in contact with magical power. These mana lanterns undergo a special magical charging process. They are designed to glow when a mana stone is placed inside. He looked at the girl and asked if she understood this principle. The girl, although she looked very surprised, nevertheless shook her head. Kiltz was pleased with this. He soon gave her her first task, to make this stone glow just as he had. The girl looked at the stone and asked the teacher if he really wanted her to imagine herself as a lantern with manas. Kiltz looked at her in surprise, saying that she understood everything very quickly, and he was glad about it. In that case, the girl clenched her fist, thinking that all she needed was to remember that feeling. She was going to make this little stone glow, and that was all she needed. However, in the end, nothing came of it, and the girl was therefore very sad. Soon, another hour passed, and still nothing happened. She tried it one last time. At that moment, the boy decided to ask Asha where she was when she succeeded in performing magic. The girl said she was in the glass garden behind the house. In that case, he suggested she try there again. Every mage has a place that best harmonizes with their energy. After some time, they finally arrived at this glass garden. The girl was once again in anticipation. When he went inside Kiltz, he said that he was very surprised that she found this place because it was very far from home. In any case, they approached the table, and placing his hand on it, Kiltz suggested that the student try using magic here again. The girl said she'd be happy to do it, but frankly, she didn't understand the difference. All that had changed was the location. Looking at that stone, she couldn't understand how it all felt back then. She honestly couldn't remember doing it, so around here was the first thing she liked. She really wanted to fix it. Soon after, she felt a tingling sensation in her palm. Something formless, weightless. It flowed like liquid, but at the same time it rose. At that very moment, Mana began to appear. The girl immediately came to her senses and began to brag to the teacher, saying that she had finally succeeded. Still, there was no answer. The wizard sat and looked straight at her, but his face was grim. The girl looked at him in bewilderment and asked if everything was okay. Just at that moment, the guy seemed to come to his senses and even jumped up a little. Asha came closer and showed the stone, which was glowing, indicating that she had done it. Kilt smiled and said that she did well, although the stone could be even brighter. But still, for the first time, it was very good. Then he raised his head and said that, as he guessed, this place was compatible with her energy, so they would teach mana control here. Asha looked at the teacher in surprise and asked what he meant by aligns with your energy. The guy explained that it was simple. She used her power better here. He also added that every mage has a preferred location. This could be an ordinary location or even an attribute. That is, an element has an attribute that corresponds to the mage. The guy said that a place with special meaning could also serve such a purpose. At that moment, Pram came into the glass garden, saying that he had brought them tea. The guy left the tea in cups and walked away. Our heroine waved after him, but wished he'd stayed and had tea with them. Asha took the cup of tea Kiltz poured and thanked him. Incidentally, he praised her for learning magic, and now she was sitting in a beautiful garden drinking tea. The girl felt like a fairy tale princess. Asha suddenly said she'd heard that Kiltz built this garden. The guy froze at that moment and quietly asked if Pram had really told her this. The girl said that was correct, and then said it was incredibly beautiful. She'd never seen so many plants, and she loved the windows. It all looks like a princess's garden. At that moment, the girl also looked at the flowers and asked the magician if he really loved flowers. The guy meanwhile took a sip of tea and soon said that this was not entirely true. In that case, she wondered why he created this garden. She thought it was because of the flowers, but he didn't like them. Kilt said no, as it was more of a whim than a great desire to create a flower garden. Soon an awkward silence fell over the garden again, which Asha decided to break by asking if she could ask a question. The boy nodded without hesitation. The girl immediately asked if she looked like anyone he knew. Without thinking twice, Kiltz gave a short answer. Yes, she did. The girl asked who it was, to which the guy replied that it was an old friend of his. Asha, surprised, asked if she really did look like his friend. Kiltz replied that she looked very similar, and he almost thought she was someone he knew. Asha, sadly looking, lowered her head and asked where the girl was now. Of course the guy couldn't say it straight out, so after a short pause, he said she was dead. Asha was shocked by these words. Now she understood why Kiltz had called her name on their first meeting. He hadn't been looking for her. They'd just met by chance, and she simply resembled her. The girl then said that she now understands why everyone is surprised when they see her. Kiltz interrupted her and asked her not to worry. Moreover, he wanted to know why she was asking these questions so persistently. But suddenly, his face changed. The reason for this was the girl's tears, which came unconsciously, but in a whole heap. Without thinking twice, the guy jumped up from his seat and went to the girl asking if she was okay. The girl was shaking violently, and her tears continued to flow. Kiltz tried to revive her and kept asking if she was okay. Still, she began shaking her head. She realized she wasn't even sad, but why couldn't she stop crying? Kiltz told her that he shouldn't have spoken about it so callously, so he asked for forgiveness. The guy also said he didn't want to talk about his friend in general, and especially not to her. This made him ruder than usual, and he was very disappointed in himself. At that moment, our heroine noticed that Kiltz's hands were shaking incredibly violently. She extended her hands, and taking his palm, said that everything was fine. He shouldn't worry. Asha smiled and said that she was just a little surprised, nothing more. Kiltz smiled back at her and told her that he should take better care of her. Soon, this became Asha Konek's little idiosyncrasy, hiding what she really wanted to say. The girl wondered. If she hadn't looked like the person he knew, would he have taken her with him or left her in the village? In any case, after this incident, a rule was established not to raise this topic again, and in general, the girl had never seen him so excited about any topic before. In any case, she knew that until she grew up, Kiltz would be kind. At that moment, the boy glanced at the tired girl and asked if something was bothering her. Of course, as expected, everything will be fine if she pretends not to know anything. The girl smiled and said that she was thinking about what she could learn during her studies. And immediately, the boy started thinking about all those fun school times where he tried to teach Asha what he knew. At that moment, he stood up from the table and said that today he would teach her something new. Asha asked again, surprised. Kiltz nodded and asked to come to class at noon. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked if she could come in. The wizard looked at her in surprise, pointing out that he hadn't exactly forbidden it. Asha reflected that she wasn't surprised it had been difficult. In any case, the girl asked if they would really have their own personal office for studying. The guy said yes, but however our heroine no longer cared what he said. After yes, she said she would definitely come. After a while, she was standing in front of the door, thinking about what the Kiltz room might look like. The girl opened the door and announced that she was going inside. As she opened the door, she expected to see something like this, but the reality was much worse than her thoughts, because Kiltz's office was in complete chaos. The girl, of course, was shocked by everything around her, but the wizard sitting at the table asked her to go inside. At that moment, our heroine asked in surprise if anyone else had been there. The guy replied that no one had been there. He was alone. He also thought for a moment and asked to give him a minute, because he would like to find a pen with a flag. He started walking around the room, checking all the drawers, and every time he did, he'd say, "That's weird, I thought I put it here." It was definitely a funny situation. Our heroine suddenly mentioned that she needed to tidy up the place. Kiltz in turn said it was the perfect setting, so there was no need to do anything. In the end, they never found the pen with the flag. The guy assumed it was somewhere in the studio upstairs. Asha asked if she should go and look there, to which the guy said she wouldn't find it. It was better to leave things as they were for today. At that moment, the guy shook off the dust and looking at the girl asked how she used the spell. Showing her hand, she said that the spell he had cast was almost gone. The guy then asked how her practice in the glass garden had gone, to which she replied that she was making some progress, that had never worked with magic. She can still sense magic without letters, but what should she say? She feels like she's trapped behind a transparent wall. Kiltz said her feelings were correct. The spell he'd written for her created a channel between the caster and the mana in the atmosphere. Even the best mage couldn't use magic without incantations. In any case, from today on, he will teach her the magic that is mainly used by northern mages. At this point, he added that he couldn't write them separately. He began to move his pen across the sheet of paper. Soon he picked it up and gave it to the girl to look at, so that she could look at it. The girl was of course serious, but she couldn't read it. Kiltz said it wasn't strange since it wasn't ordinary language. The guy explained that it was an ancient letter from the tower. They usually use expressions to remember spells. The girl suddenly asked if she could use the magic at any time, even if she rewrote it many times. Kiltz replied that all these spells were one-time use. Once used, it loses all its functions just like a ticket, so she needs to rewrite the spell every time, which means she needs to remember it. Handing Asha some papers and a pen, he said that this would be her homework for today. He explained that he would gradually teach her a combination of methods, but first he needed to rewrite this ancient script. If she had difficulty using the pen, she could write with something else. Asha asked when she'd be able to use magic without drawing it. Kiltz looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. It was literally impossible. However, the girl looked at Kiltz in surprise and reminded him that he was using them without a spell. The guy turned his head to the side and said that in his case, everything was a little different. Rather, it could be considered an exception. The very next evening, the girl ran to Kiltz and proudly showed him the sheets of paper covered with writing. Stroking the girl on the head, he said that she had worked hard, but next time it would be worth paying attention to the handwriting. Asha said she understood him and then asked if she could play there before bed. Without hesitation, the guy agreed, and Asha happily ran off to explore everything there was to see. At that moment, a strange object covered with a white sheet caught her attention. Asha asked what it was. Kiltz said it was a magically powered research device that helps improve the ability to see distant objects. Asha asked in surprise how far she could see. With this, Kiltz replied that she could see stars with it. Pointing the telescope, he asked her to look in that direction. What she now sees is the northern star sight. The girl quickly looked into the glass, hoping to see a clear picture, but unfortunately, everything didn't look as good as she thought. Kiltz said that quality is directly proportional to the wizard's magical power. At her level, she couldn't yet see it clearly. Asha sighed and said she understood. She wondered if her vision would improve once her magical powers improved. Kiltz did not answer her question, but looking at her, he called her to ask his question. The girl responded, and the boy in turn pointed into the distance. Asha looked where Kiltz was pointing. He asked if she could see Alton from here. It appears briefly in the north, at the beginning of summer, and then disappears. In the south, it is considered the brightest star. Asha asked in surprise if the stars really looked different in the north and south. Kiltz replied that they did. They saw a completely different sky. Even the laws of time worked differently in the south. Of course, the girl asked how it happened. The boy replied that Alton appears there after sunset around midnight. While Alton floats across the sky, it seems as if fog has covered the entire world. People in the south believe the sun rises and sets twice a day. Asha excitedly expressed her desire to see this one day. However, Kiltz's answer was unexpected. He suggested that it would be better for her not to know the outside world. Our heroine, of course, asked the logical question that was on everyone's mind. Why can't she do it? Kiltz replied that human curiosity always grew in a terrible form, because these words were like a knife cutting itself. Asha, however, still didn't quite understand the white desert on the lunar sea, the 7 islands of Izmikan, the great labyrinth of Egeron, which is the dragon's heart. Even the ivory tower standing alone at the end of the North Sea counts the world as incredibly vast. But in comparison, our heroine was incredibly small. She didn't understand why she had to accept this ban. Having begun to reach for the stars, the girl said she wanted to know more. She wanted to go there. At this point, Kiltz turned to the girl, saying that there was a surveillance machine in the ivory tower much larger than this one. This machine is just a replica of the one in the turret, so their performance cannot be compared. Our heroine looked at the wizard in surprise and asked why such a thing was in the ivory tower. The guy said it was now known as the Tower of Magic, but it was originally built for observation purposes. Asha asked why surprised. Kiltz explained that this was all because the ivory tower mages still hadn't found. At that moment, silence fell over the room. Our heroine asked again what they hadn't found. Soon the guy said they hadn't found Ingram. Asha, perplexed, asked what it was. As Kiltz noted, writers describe Ingram as having an unwavering spirit. Lyric scholars sometimes compare it to a curiosity about the taboo. And again the girl asked what curiosity was. The boy explained that it was a pull toward the other side, a desire for the unknown. That's what constitutes a taboo. No one knows the details, but it's impossible not to agree that everyone is drawn to where they want to return, so they gather in different places and just observe. They look at the sea over which that same golden bird once flew. At that moment, the door to Kiltz's office opened. A small voice was heard. As it turned out, it was Sleepy Pram, who came to remind us that it was time to sleep. Our heroine left the room and immediately said goodbye to Kiltz, wishing him good night. However, looking at the restless Kiltz, the girl understood what he was thinking about then. She was sure without a doubt that he missed the departed Ingram. The action moves to the bedroom. The girl takes out a book and suggests reading it together before bed. Pram sighed heavily and said it was too late. Asha, however, asked to read just a little. Again, the boy sighed, but still agreed. He asked her to go to bed as soon as she finished reading. The girl was delighted, so she began reading right away. Long ago, on the other side of their world, there lived a huge dragon. The huge dragon slept. He slept in the darkness for a very long time. But one day, he opened his eyes and saw a bird with golden feathers. He'd never seen her before, but it seemed as if the bird was watching him. She flapped her wings, scattering light, and Pram noticed she was yawning and advised them to go to bed. After a while, he was sheltering a girl who asked the boy in surprise where he was from. Was he really from the north? Still, the guy raised his hand and pointed to the window, whatever that meant. The action takes us to the next day. A new day, new lessons with Kiltz, who was just telling Asha that she had done something wrong. The girl looked at him embarrassedly, and he told her not to even pretend to cry. He asked if such a technique was in the book. The girl said she'd meant to look it up, but she hadn't had time. She thought the meaning would be clear. Kiltz was perplexed by the logic that it could be said that a normal egg was a manastone egg. The girl sighed heavily and collapsed onto the table. Kiltz was usually kind to her. However, for some reason now, he looks more like Mr. Kiltz, the big demon king. She sighed and said that he'd first told her she deserved credit for anything she could do. Kiltz said that was true, but he wanted to convey that with her skills, she could easily do it. The girl slammed the table and screamed, saying that normal people couldn't memorize an entire book in 3 days. Kiltz sighed and asked for a pen. At that very moment, the boy began to scribble with a pen, and the girl sat frowning, thinking that Kiltz had apparently forgotten that she was 10 years old. The guy soon handed her the piece of paper, and our heroine looked at it in surprise, saying that it looked as if Kiltz had written it all over again. The teacher told her that if she didn't understand, she'd better read it and come back with a more rational formula. And he also asked her to classify and analyze 12 components of magical stones. Asha began desperately pretending she didn't know. She couldn't understand how he remembered everything so well. In any case, she said she did the best she could. The guy said it was the right answer, but the fundamental approach was ineffective. He asked for some corrections. Asha said that in that case, she wouldn't have time to look up the theory of magic, and the 5 great elements. Kiltz pointed at her and asked them to start there, and they'd see each other in 2 hours. Soon, Kiltz really did leave her and go about his business, and our heroine was left alone with her studies. Taking a sip of the tea Pram had brought, she realized that if it weren't for this wonderful drink, she would have already passed out. At that moment, the girl decided to ask where Pram had learned magic. She assumed he had learned it from Kiltz. However, he said that wasn't true. The guy wasn't a natural-born magician at all. Asha was surprised to hear that he'd helped her in the glass garden. Kiltz replied that Pram himself is a living doll, so it is natural for him to have a connection with a fellow doll. He used himself as a spell-casting machine, and she was the caster. A moment later, the girl screamed perplexed that Pram was a doll. Kiltz asked in surprise if she hadn't known. The girl said that this was the first time she had heard about this, because no one had told her this news. Kiltz said Pram moves like a person. He has emotions, he is well-made, but at the end of the day, he is a machine. If Pram runs out of magic one day, he will probably die. Or rather, in the distant future, if his mana core breaks, then maybe... The girl stood up and said that even if it broke, could it be restored by the power of Kiltz? The guy shook his head and said that even he couldn't do that. This wasn't the kind of technology Astier created. This was the power of the other side of the world. Asha looked at the guy with even more interest and surprise, who noticed this look and said goodbye to her, saying that tomorrow they would call it a day. Our heroine sighed heavily and, puffing out her cheeks, said that he was incredibly picky. The guy was surprised at this point and soon asked the girl what she had said. Asha replied that she hadn't said anything. A moment later, the boy began laughing uncontrollably. The girl didn't understand what was happening or what she'd said that was so funny. But still, when Kiltz laughs, she is happy too, so the girl began to laugh with him. After a while, the action takes us to the dining room, where Kiltz was sitting with a wreath on his head. Trying to avoid unnecessary questions, he said Asha did it. Haskan smiled and said it suited him. At that moment, our heroine said she'd heard that today is the day to give flowers to the teacher. She also wove some for Grandpa and Pram. The girl gave everyone gifts and said that they were all her friends, and she was glad to make them happy, considering that, thanks to them, she was happy too. Haskan said she'd recently made more friends. He asked if she wanted to go out into the world and make new friends. The girl sighed and said that maybe she would like to, and she also wanted to go to school. All her glances inadvertently slid toward Kiltz. However, the guy couldn't think of anything better to do than turn around. What a cheeky fellow. The man sighed and said that if he couldn't send Asha to school, he would tell her about the times when he was a teacher. Asha joyfully asked if he would really do this for her, and Kiltz instantly turned to the old man. Their eyes met. So in the royal family, he was 100 times weaker than he is now. He even thought that if he wounded Kiltz, he wouldn't bleed. Kiltz, perplexed, asked what era he was talking about. Asha laughed and suggested he'd been even stricter. Back then, Haskan laughed and said many people even bet on making him laugh. Asha assumed that if he was of noble blood, then so was his grandfather. The man in turn said he had never received any status or anything like that. In that case, our heroine wanted to know how they met. At that moment, a dead silence fell over the table again. Our heroine asked, confused, what had happened. Had she asked the wrong question? Kiltz sighed and said that Haskan worked as a courtier for the Cauldron's family. Our heroine asked how that was possible. Could it be that even if he wasn't of royal blood, he could? Haskan explained that the nobility needed assistance. Even if this young man wasn't royal, he'd been entrusted with the title of mage. Asha said she understood, but she didn't understand why nobles were noble. Kiltz replied that there was no longer any reason for that humans are creatures that cannot live without social stratification. The Astiers also talk about equality, but in reality, class divisions prevail in society. How could anyone even think of using Egeron shards? Our heroine asked what it was. Haskan said the little girl had been asking a lot of questions lately. He then told Kiltz that since he'd brought it up, he should explain. Grandpa explained that if he started telling the story, it would take a long time. Our heroine smiled and said she wanted to listen. Scratching his head, the man said he could make an exception for her. And so this was 50 years ago when magic was a mystery. Very few people knew how to use it because no one knew what magic was. But then someone broke into the great palace in Egeron Taboo. The place that served as a refuge was hidden. Our heroine said she'd heard that dragons guarded the innermost part of the great palace. Hazkan said there had been such rumors, but there was only one thing they were certain of. They emerged from the heart of the great palace with a vast treasure. It was the Egeron shard. This thing allowed ordinary people to feel what magic was. With this fragment, the cities in the center were united into Astier. Even now, they supply various goods to the townspeople and raise taxes. This is what caused his falling out with Caldrigan. The girl asked why this had happened. The old man replied that it was because the central regions had united to form the largest country on the continent. This made the great kings of Astier even more arrogant. What was it called? The name they liked to call themselves. Kilt suddenly said that the theft and use of power that was not given at birth is the self-proclamation of a mysterious conqueror. However, our heroine looked at him and suggested that it was better when many people knew magic. Once again, he saw rose in Asha's face, so for a moment he even lost the sense of weight. Hazkan turned to him and advised him to finish eating quickly as he needed to grow. At that moment, the boy stood up and told them to finish eating without him, and he would go. Our heroine was surprised that he stood up so abruptly and decided to run away. In any case, after some time, she had a whole pile of documents in her hands. Hazkan looked at this in bewilderment and said that he would still show Kilts how to give children work. The man began to support the little girl, telling her he was on her side. He wished her luck and sent her off to talk to Kilts. Meanwhile, the guy was in his room alone with his thoughts. The girl had a great idea in an instant, so she started sneaking towards him. A few seconds later, she pounced on Kilts with joyful cries because she wanted to scare him. However, the boy didn't react at all. He turned his head in surprise and looked at the girl. Asha asked in surprise if he hadn't expected this turn of events. Kilts nodded and said it was very unexpected. But these words didn't exactly inspire confidence, so the girl said she didn't think so. Still, Kilts picked her up, saying he was surprised. At that moment, the girl looked at what he was reading and asked in surprise if this was really the story of a huge dragon and a golden bird. The girl happily said she really liked her. Kilts was surprised and asked if it was true. Our heroine said it was true. Now she could read everything, so the huge dragon decided to follow the golden bird. The huge dragon, having awakened, flew in the footsteps of the golden bird from the other side of the world, but the dragon, having lost its strength, was crushed on its way. The giant was on the verge of death, but finally he saw the golden bird Ingram flying by. After this, the huge dragon watched the starry sky with a sense of pride. Our heroine was glad the story had ended well. At that moment, Kilts, with a smile on his face, said that she no longer made mistakes. The girl proudly declared that she'd read it more than once. Kilts then asked what about the theory of magic and the 5 great elements. At that moment, Asha's expression changed. The magician laughed and told her it was already late today, so she would finish reading tomorrow. At this moment, Kilts's face was calm, and one could even say happy. Of course, our heroine noticed this and decided to ask him what he was thinking about. Without thinking twice, the guy said what he thought he'd ask her for tomorrow. Asha, angry as a bear, stomped off to her room, saying it was unfair. Soon the girl left the room and bid Kilts good night. Naturally, the boy wished her good night in return. Our heroine ran down the hallway to her room to have a little chat with Pram, but she stopped, suddenly realizing that she needed to take a couple of books with her. Entering the room, she picked up the books she wanted and then wondered, where had Kilts gone? At that very moment, she heard a strange noise coming from another room. Without thinking twice, the girl followed closer to find out what was going on. In the room, she saw Kilts, who was sitting on his knees, looking at the moonlit sky and muttering something. Our heroine also heard him crying. She really wanted him to stop crying. She could help him wipe away his tears, but she understood that he simply would not allow this to happen, so the girl turned around and went to her room. The action takes place the next day. Our heroine burst into Kilts's room early in the morning and began waking him up. She came here because the cleaning fairy, aka Pram, asked her to take a box to Kilts's room. The girl assumed he was somewhere around here. At that moment, our heroine turned her head and noticed the wreath she was giving him. She immediately ran up to him, because she was very happy to see that he had kept the wreath, which was 6 months old. She noticed something else in the same way. It was a bouquet that, wait, our heroine remembered that she had collected this bouquet for her father, and on the fateful day of their meeting, she had lost it out of fear. Looking at this bouquet, she couldn't understand why he kept it. And was there really magic on them? Anyway, the action shifts to evening. Our heroes were sitting on the porch eating cake. At that moment, Asha turned to Prem. She said someone picked up what she'd lost and took it, but ultimately didn't tell her about it. Why did they do that? Prem suggested that it was so important to him that he didn't want to return it. Our heroine looked at the sky in surprise and said that if it wasn't that important, then everything was fine. After some time, the gates opened, which meant that Kiltz was finally back. Our heroine ran up to him, asking where he'd been. The guy smiled and said he wanted to give her something. Soon after these words, he handed her a wrapped item along with some note. The girl was very surprised, so she decided to unpack it right away. As it turned out, it was a letter, and it read, "To my brilliant student Asha Konak, with the hope that the path of adventure she will take in the future will be a journey." At that moment, Kiltz said that it would soon be a year since she came to this house. Our heroine immediately began to happily unpack the next gift. As soon as she opened it to her surprise, she discovered that it was a robe. Kiltz suddenly said that he had first thought about clothes or toys, but then remembered that in Ivory Castle, there was a custom of receiving robes woven with magic. In any case, he reminded her that she would receive a formal robe when she became an adult, but she could try this one on. Also, if she didn't like it, she wasn't obligated to wear it. The girl was shocked that he would dare to say such words. She hugged Kiltz's gift and said she would wear it. At the same moment, she noticed that a strange bow had fallen out of her robe. Taking it in his hands, Kiltz said that it seemed to him that her hair had grown a lot, so she would need it. The girl turned her head and, holding out a bow, asked to tie her hair. Of course, he was very surprised by this request, because he had no previous experience in this matter. After some time of the wizard's efforts, our heroine asked him how her hair was doing, to which the guy said that it was just a nightmare. However, he apologized because it was not her fault, but his skills. At that moment, our heroine looked at herself. Asha was so surprised that Kiltz was expecting the worst, but the girl asked if there was anything he couldn't handle. Thus, history began to flow of its own accord, and soon 6 whole years had passed. Asha was 17 years old at the time, and right now she and Pram have returned home with groceries. Huzkan sat in a rocking chair and was surprised that the boys had arrived so early. Asha told him she'd bought something Grandpa would love. Holding out the bag, she said that these were pickled chestnuts, and also Huzkan interrupted the girl at this point. The man, perplexed, asked who the person with them was. The girl said she didn't understand, to which he replied that they were being followed. At that moment, our heroine remembered that her grandfather could see other people's memories. Pram suddenly said that nothing had happened and that they had simply left. Asha also smiled and said it was a secret for Kiltz. At that very moment, by coincidence, he also came outside and immediately asked what they were talking about. The girl, terrified, realized that if she was caught, she'd be banned from leaving, so with the same smile, she said it was a joke. There were no secrets. At that moment, the gates swung open, and soon a joyful voice was heard saying that he thought he would die before he found this place. There was an unknown guy standing at the door, whom our heroine, of course, did not know. The first question she asked herself was, who the hell is he and how did he find them? Kiltz in turn whispered the guy's name, Eurus. The boy cried out joyfully and told the master that everything was true. It really was him. His beloved student had returned. He started running happily, saying he'd been wandering around for a long time, so this trick was interesting, as expected of a teacher. By the way, didn't he miss you? However, Kiltz, surprised, told the boy that he didn't remember having a student like him. The boy, perplexed, said he was very angry. Our heroine looked at Kiltz in surprise, who in turn asked the guy in surprise how he got here. Hadn't he been to Astier? Eurus launched into a whole unbelievable story about his adventures. Kiltz only understood the first few words, so he asked him to keep it brief. Eurus turned his head and said he was coming here for this lady. Naturally, his gaze fell on Asha. At that moment, Kiltz turned around and said he understood the situation. He could stay and do whatever he wanted. Eurus, perplexed, asked if the teacher wouldn't ask why. Kiltz turned around and said he was going to say no either way. Was that really what he wanted to hear? The boy immediately sank, but Haskan smiled and said that since that was the case, he might as well at least eat before leaving. With tears in his eyes, the boy began to nod his head and thank the old man. Soon the boy joyfully approached the Haskan and asked if this was really number 16. The old man introduced himself and asked if the boy really wanted to be thrown out. Yuris said he had no idea he was a teacher too. He didn't even recognize him. When this happens, he realizes a lot of time has passed. Haskan, however, told the boy that his face hadn't changed. He was just as hideous. Yuris laughed, saying that Aragon's relics were of great use. It was a slave contract in exchange for the position of Professor Yefranger, but in any case, wasn't this the body that swore to follow the path of magic? Our heroine was in shock at that moment. At that moment, she remembered that as a child, she had dated a guy who was going to enroll in Yefranger. Asha looked at the guy in bewilderment and asked if he was really a professor at Yefranger. The guy turned around and said, yes. He's the head of magical biology at Yefranger. His name is Martin Juris. Soon the action shifts to the table. Our heroine excitedly asks if he really went to Ivory Tower with kilts. Juris laughed and said that wasn't true. He had been his assistant when he was Caldrigan's court magician. He was 21 years old at the time. He wasn't particularly competent. Asha was surprised because he looked quite young at the time. She asked how long ago that had been. The boy replied to her that at that time he was just a stone mana egg who couldn't even create the correct formulas. Haskan explained the boy's incomprehensible words by saying that a stone egg is an idiom among mages, meaning young. It was once invented by mages with bad tempers. Our heroine smiled and said she understood, and then asked how old Kiltz was. The guy laughed and said that neither Professor Kiltz nor he looked their age. Asha then assumed it was a secret. Juris took up his food and told the girl that she was quite abrupt, and by the way, more mature than the students at Yefranger. The girl immediately asked if he could tell her about Yefranger. She'd once read that they didn't recognize the great elements. Was that true? Juris replied that it was more likely the Astyr mages who didn't recognize the existence of the fifth element Asha, however said that the fifth element was the caster themselves. How could it not exist? The professor smiled and asked the lady if she knew about the Aragon artifacts. They were a vast magical resource discovered 50 years ago. Magic in Astyr works through banners and wands bearing these artifacts. Essentially, the artifact is considered the caster, not the person. Asha suggested that magic was a blessing for Astyr. He said that few people are born with innate powers. Magic had previously been used only by a select few. In their days in Astyr, anyone could use magic regardless of their origin. Haskan suddenly remarked that they got along well. Juris laughed and said they could learn a lot. Asha suddenly asked, surprised if Kiltz was really that amazing. The professor said it was an absolute fact. He was the last legend of Ivory Tower and a descendant of the Grey Pilgrim. All the mages in Astyr combined couldn't compare to him. The guy also said his lessons are notoriously difficult to understand. He can only imagine how much she must be suffering. Asha laughed and said that it was true at first, but now everything is fine. They are not so complicated that they suffer. At that moment, silence fell. Soon the boy jumped up, starting to tell the teacher it was unfair. Why couldn't he have been as calm when he was teaching him? In response to these words, the voice of Kiltz followed, saying that he could always start teaching him again. The guy said he'd be happy to repeat any material he wanted. Juris even shuddered. He said everything was fine, and it seemed he'd overreacted. Nevertheless, he began to try to say something again, but Kiltz interrupted him and said, no. Juris, perplexed, said that he hadn't even listened to him. The guy said Astyr was looking for qualified mages, regardless of background or status. Kiltz said they'd heard rumors too, so he knew. At this point, Haskan asked in surprise if it was true that Astyr was planning a war or something similar. Juris, however, said it was a secret. Soon after, the guy turned his gaze to Asha, who was sitting and did not know what to do. At that very moment, the guy joyfully asked if he was right in knowing that she would be 17 this year. Juris immediately said that the new semester would start very soon, so this was the perfect time, and there might be a free place among the graduates. The guy said he could even write a recommendation. A student of Master Kiltz would be more qualified than others. The girl started saying she'd like to, but for obvious reasons, Kiltz interrupted her and said that he definitely said no. Our heroine immediately asked, perplexed why she couldn't go. The guy in turn turned and walked away, saying that was the end of the conversation. The action soon shifts outside. Kilt stood in the middle of the path, looking into the distance with Asha running behind him. Our heroine came up and said that she wanted to enroll in Yafranger, so she wanted to hear consent. The guy said at that moment that all they teach there is practical knowledge about how to serve the nobility. Is that really what she wants to learn? The girl said she wanted to see Aragon artifacts and learn more about Astir magic. Kiltz replied that if that was her ultimate goal, he could show her and teach her all of this right now. Their magic is nothing more than childish imitation dependent on artifacts. It's not real magic. If she wants to leave, she must give a more worthy reason. Our heroine reproached him for saying that reading about things isn't the same as actually experiencing them. He taught her that himself. Kilt said the world was cruel. There might be people who looked down on her just because of her birth. Asha replied that he didn't know what would happen in the future. However, he said he was speaking from experience. Asha still said that even if that were the case, she wouldn't mind. The mage in turn turned around and said that he was the one who was against it. He didn't want her to get hurt. Our heroine responded to his words by saying that even if it hurt her, it certainly wouldn't affect him. It had nothing to do with it. However, Kiltz's expression spoke for itself. The girl realized that she shouldn't expect understanding from him. Soon she turned around and ran home with tears in her eyes. She didn't understand how long he would treat her like a little child. After a while, the action takes us home, or more precisely, to Kiltz's office. Hazkan was sitting at the entrance, telling the boy to let her go. He knew how much she wanted it. Kiltz, nevertheless, said that someone there might recognize her. For example, Dean Hazkan responded by saying that Astir hadn't been concerned about Kaldrogan for a long time. Of course, there's Kaisor, but that man is obsessed with all sorts of strange things. At that moment, Kiltz said he didn't care about Kaisor. He didn't want her to know any of this. Still, the old man told the boy he should put his ego aside. What would happen if she found out? He couldn't keep her in the dark forever. Hazkan also said that he sees her looking at the school every time she goes into town. At that moment, Kiltz sighed, and looking out the window, said that if she went to Astir, he would not see her. In that case, the old man told him to go with her if that's all he cared about. He'd be her teacher forever. Kiltz replied that staying here was the best option. Of course, in any case, it's better than being with an alcoholic father, but this place is not paradise either. The world is full of dark things that are better left unknown. He wants her to see only beauty and hear only kind words. Stood up and shouted that he would not allow the same mistake to happen again. However, at that moment, there was silence in the room, after which Hazkan said that he was crazy. Kiltz's expression changed instantly. He asked what it meant. The old man replied that he sometimes forgot that Asha was just another living person. Hazkan said she wasn't a pet. Tasty food and pretty toys wouldn't keep her in place. Nevertheless, Kiltz slammed the table and ordered Hazkan Yuzik to stop lecturing him. Nothing would make him change his mind. Soon, Hazkan decided to change the subject. Bowing his head, the old man looked at the floor, commenting on how Eurus had called him the 16th. Kiltz's face instantly changed from anger to shock. He certainly wasn't prepared to hear those words. The man in turn said that he was too old to remember that 10-year dispute. However, they both knew that Kiltz was still with him for a long time, and that shouldn't be forgotten. Kiltz, surprised, asked what he could do now. Even if he killed him, the past couldn't be changed. In that case, the old man suggested sending the girl to school, and then their score would be settled. An old man, who was about to die a living corpse, stuck in time a doll that can break at any moment. Turning around, Hazkan told the wizard that the girl could not be allowed to rot with such trash. Even before closing the door, he said that life was too valuable for this. The action soon shifts to the next day. Our heroine stood before Eurus. The guy smiled happily at that moment and told her that they would see each other in Yafranger. Our heroine was surprised he was coming back. He'd come all the way here after all. What about his hometown? The guy said he'd left his seal for a letter of recommendation. Incidentally, even if he returned home now, there wasn't a single person he knew there. In any case, he wished her luck and said they'd see each other in a week. The girl smiled and watched him go, thanking him for calling her. Immediately after the guy left the area, the girl turned around and decided that it was time for her to get ready too. At that moment, Asha raised her head and noticed that Kiltz was watching her. She decided that even if they'd had a fight, she couldn't ignore him completely. She raised her hand to greet him, but without even having time to say a word, Kiltz simply turned around and closed the curtain behind him. Our heroine immediately began wondering about various things. Had he really become disillusioned with her because of her persistence? However, he himself should know that he is not a talkative person, so why is he being so stubborn? One way or another, she began to climb the stairs. Kiltz came out of the room in front of her, also surprised to see them here. The girl, however, walked past him silently and with a stony face, thinking that she too might be angry with him, but she still decided to stop to look back. And at that moment, she saw Kiltz's face. Asha sped up even more, and running into her room wondered, why did he look at her like that? His face was incredibly sad, but she couldn't understand why he was like that. In any case, the action is postponed for a week. Prom helped the girl pack. He gave her socks, other things, and even a pillow. Asha laughed and said it wouldn't fit in the suitcase. However, the guy said with surprise that she would not be able to sleep without this pillow. And immediately, with tears in her eyes, she ran to Prom, saying that she would miss him. The guy sighed and said that he did too. Moreover, he would really like to go with her too. Asha asked what Grandpa and Kiltz would do without him, to which he replied that they could manage on their own. Confused Hazkan asked if he really wanted to dump everything on the old man. In any case, the old man also said he'd feel better if she went with someone. Our heroine, perplexed, asked if he was really going there too. One way or another, after some time, the suitcase was packed, which meant it was time to leave. Soon the action takes us outside. It was time to say goodbye, so they went out to wish the girl good luck. Prom hugged Asha and asked her to take care of herself. The girl smiled and asked if she understood correctly as usual. After this, the girl ran to Hazkan, saying that there was no need for any sentimentality. Hugging him, she thanked him for everything. At that moment, the Hassan asked her not to let stupid children belittle her, and also to study hard. In any case, he decided she knew all this herself. Asha nodded, indicating that she had the best teacher. Just then, footsteps were heard. Of course it was Kiltz who came out to say goodbye to her, but decided not to send her away empty-handed. The guy said it was a magical letter-sending box. At Yefranger, all letters are checked, so if she wants to write to him, she just needs to put the letter inside. Incidentally, our heroine seemed to have seen something similar in his office. In any case, she said it was a very unusual artifact and was curious about its origin. Kiltz said he made it himself, and she needn't worry about being caught since it had protective spells. Asha suggested Yefranger might raise questions. Kiltz, however, said that this was not the case at all. The girl then asked, surprised if this wasn't against the rules. Hearing no answer, Kiltz simply said he'd walk her to Briand. A couple of minutes later, they were on their way. Asha couldn't understand whether this was an attempt at reconciliation. Suddenly, he turned to the girl saying he didn't know if she remembered something. The girl asked what happened, and the boy said that he once said that he didn't want her to know about the outside world. He admitted that even now he does not want to let her go, and does so with great force. If he had his way, he would lock her in the house and never let her out. His expression was tense. The guy also added that if his hands weren't tied, he would have done just that. Our heroine's expression after these words left much to be desired. The girl recalled that he also told her that he would give her everything she wanted. She explained that she wanted to go to school, make friends, and learn Astur magic. She has so much she wants to learn. Kiltz, however, said that she would soon realize that everything was far from what she had imagined. She would be better off not knowing about some things at all. In any case, he asked why she wanted it so much. In response, Asha asked if he remembered the words about what awaited her. She recalled his letter, which said that the path of adventure she would take in the future would be a journey filled with wonderful things. He wrote it to her himself. The world is so big and full of mysteries, and she wants to solve them all herself. That's why she asked him to let her go. Kiltz sighed heavily and said that the last word always remains with her. Asha laughed and said that no teacher can defeat their student. Kiltz, surprised, asked who said that. He'd never heard it before. The girl laughed and said that she was the one saying it, and that she had just made it up. Kiltz smiled back and said he would let her go on one condition. Asha asked what the condition would be, to which the guy asked not to mention him at the academy, and not because she was his student. The girl assumed he wanted to keep his secret. Kiltz nodded and said he was glad she understood that. Asha took his hands and said she'd be back as soon as the semester ended and would write a lot. Kiltz replied that he'd be waiting for her letters. After a while, the action shifts to the city. Eurus met the guys, so our heroine said goodbye to Kiltz. Finally, Kiltz smiled and said that he wished her luck and a safe journey. A couple of minutes later, they were at the station. Seeing all these structures and trains, Asha asked in surprise if this was really a station. She said it all looked more like a palace. Eurus also said she'd be even more surprised to learn that these paths aren't finished yet. He explained that they were now only reaching the borders of Astier, and that next year work would be completed on laying routes to eastern Nurmaz, through the large meadows. Our heroine was surprised because these meadows are so vast. Asha decided to ask why they were laying out these paths. Eurus replied that it is the efficient transportation of goods that is the basis of prosperity. A short time later, our heroine was inside the train. Upon entering, the professor asked the girl to get in, as the train might soon begin moving. At this point, the girl asked what filion was, because she had heard this word on the street. The guy explained that astier is a form of address for a young unmarried woman. For example, she would be filian konak. The form of address for a man is Firaman. Asha asked if she understood correctly that she should address him as Firaman Eurus, to which he replied that he was too old for that. It was better to just call him Professor Eurus. By the way, he suddenly said that he knew it was inappropriate to talk about a lady's appearance, but she looked very much like her. Did the teacher mention anyone by any chance? Asha said yes. She looked like someone he knew. Eurus said he was only saying this because the teacher wasn't here right now. He followed her because he was surprised to see her. It's no understatement to say that she looks exactly like that girl. Our heroine was certainly surprised that even he knew about this girl. Eurus suddenly laughed and suggested that Kiltz had used the word acquaintance instead of any name. The girl nodded and said that was true. Eurus paused, saying he didn't think that word was appropriate to describe her. Their relationship was on a slightly different level, something like. At that moment, Eurus noticed how attentively the girl was listening to him. The guy immediately started waving his hand, saying that he would probably stop there because Teacher Kiltz could behead him. Asha assumed this girl had some connection to the royal court. Perhaps she worked there? Eurus asked, surprised, how she came to this conclusion. The girl said she felt like Kiltz had worked at the royal court during their time together. The professor smiled and told her she'd fit right in at the academy. At this point, he also suggested that she take a rest, since they still had a very long way to go. Soon the girl took a book out of her bag and said that she would read it. Eurus glanced at it and said that studying magic opened up the story in a new light. He used to read it all the time as a child too. Asha asked in surprise why that was. The professor was very surprised and asked if she really didn't know. So they say this tale is actually about the history of magicians. In the north, where dragons are still worshipped, magicians are called the heirs of the dragon's blood. Eurus explained that this is why some people think this story and the mages are connected. It also ties into the founding of Caldragan. 1,000 years ago, before the current kingdoms emerged on the continent, the first mage appeared. Asha assumed it was the Grey Pilgrim, the forefather of the Ivory Tower. And that was true. But in ancient times, he was considered an outcast. He wandered the continent, avoiding everyone. Then he met someone from the Caldrins clan, the ancestor of the royal Caldragan family. They eventually made a pact with each other and became friends. The mage helped found the kingdom of Caldrogan. The girl asked why the Grey Pilgrim chose Caldrins. There were many theories, but some say the first Caldrins was named Ingram after the golden bird. In any case, the professor said that after Ingram conquered the north, with the help of the magician, he gave him something as payment for the contract. Asha, of course, wanted to know what it was, so she asked what he gave him. The boy replied that he had given him passage to the Starry Sea. The girl sighed and asked if he meant the ending of the book. The professor said it was all true. They say all mages are doomed to yearn for him. Ingram's flight path is the end of the Eastern Sea. The girl said she didn't understand what exactly was supposed to be in this passage. Eurus said no one knew. That part wasn't part of the legend. In any case, he said the mage, having thanked Caldrins, departed for the Starry Sea. The king missed his dear friend so much that he built an observatory tower on Cape Futility. Asha finished with amazement, saying that this became the Ivory Tower. Eurus glanced out the window and said it was all pure speculation. There was no evidence to support it. Such legends inevitably become distorted over time. After some time, the guys were on their way, and Eurus was sleeping soundly in the meantime. At that moment, our heroine sensed mana and realized it was Astier. She sensed a powerful spell. In any case, she understood that she would now study here, although she couldn't believe it. Looking out the window, the girl suddenly remembered a similar conversation she'd once had with Kiltz. What had he said then? Sighing, she realized that no matter how hard she tried to remember it, she simply couldn't. Soon after, the girl, following Professor Uris's example, fell asleep, and the train continued to carry them to the city. Meanwhile, in the bright sky above this train, a golden bird was flying, watching them. A short time later, the action takes us to Astyr. Our heroine was told they were there, so she immediately looked out the window. The girl was pleasantly surprised, and one could say she was in shock because the beautiful Jafranjir was opening up before her. Juris looked out in the same way and said that this used to be the old monastery of Kaldrogan. Its shape resembles a building in the north, but the white exterior is so beautiful. They love this color here. Incidentally, she'll see Astyr-style architecture everywhere, even in restoration projects. Asha was shocked by the school's size. She asked if all of these were classrooms. Uris laughed and said that some of them were rooms for official meetings and ceremonies. Soon the boys exited the train and were heading toward the Jefranger gate. At that moment, someone emerged from inside. Looking at the girls, Asha asked if this was really a school uniform. Uris nodded and said he'd just remembered she needed one too. Anyway, to start, he suggested we come into his office. Our heroine was thrilled. She couldn't wait to get her own uniform. A moment later, they were inside Uris's office. The man asked them to make themselves at home, and he would go and make them some tea. Soon after, the girl picked up the cup and said she thought all mages were filthy, but his office looked neat. Although she only knows one mage and his office. Uris asked in surprise who it was, and Asha said she was talking about Kiltz. His office was so dirty, it was hard to find a pen. The professor was naturally surprised. The boy asked how that was possible. Wasn't the teacher obsessed with cleanliness? Asha laughed and asked again, perplexed. Uris suggested he might have softened over the years. In any case, he gave her all the paperwork and advised her to go to the dorm to register, and Miss Ruth would take care of everything. Our heroine was incredibly happy. She was a Jefranger student. Her dream had come true. After some time at the registration point, the girl said that these documents were not enough for admission to the dormitory. This girl was Miss Ruth, who was the director of the girls' dormitory. The girl suddenly looked at the student and asked her name. Asha introduced herself, but didn't understand why the director was asking her. Looking at the paper, and soon after, at the girl, she asked who her guardian was. Asha smiled and said that Professor Martin Juris was her guardian while she was here. Miss Ruth then said that she knew Professor Juris was on vacation. Asha said that was true, but he had returned to help her. The woman immediately asked if there were any guardianship documents. Our heroine was in a panic, because the professor hadn't said anything else was needed. She just said that the professor had given her all the necessary documents. Laying her hand on the documents, Miss Ruth said that in this case, all her documentation would be called into question, so she could not allow her to register yet. Our heroine asked in surprise what she should do. Ruth replied that she needed to provide documents confirming her representation. Asha was even more panicked because Kiltz was home now. Should she go back to pick up the document? At that moment, a guy with red hair opened the door to the director's office and immediately said in surprise that he didn't know that Miss Ruth had a visitor. Anyway, he came in and asked what was wrong. Our heroine said that Miss Ruth had mentioned the need for a guardianship certificate, but she didn't have one. The guy asked again, to which the girl replied that the student hadn't provided all the necessary documents. This is a common mistake. The guy asked to see the documents. So Asha Konak, from Kalincia, her guardian is Professor Juris. According to the order, she is being enrolled through a special process. He was surprised that she had special clearance, but soon said that he did not see any problems. However, the director said that any person who has a guardian instead of their representative must provide identification documents. The guy, perplexed, began to say that if she had a guardian, then the representative simply couldn't come. It even takes 3 weeks for newspapers from Kalincia to get here. He asked if Miss Ruth really wanted the girl to sleep outside. He asked her to be gentle with her. The principal still mentioned the rules. The guy smiled and said he'd brought the very book she'd asked for, so the matter was settled. They could go and Miss Ruth would take care of everything. Asha thanked him. A short time later, the boys were outside. The girl sheepishly thanked the guy for his help. He told her that Miss Ruth was simply unbearable. He had never heard of anyone asking for any kind of guardianship certificate. Asha didn't understand why she did it, since they were even meeting for the first time. The guy said he had no idea either. Maybe this is what it means to be an old lady. The girl wondered why this happened, and at that moment, the guy asked if she remembered him. Our heroine looked at him and actually noticed that this was the same boy she saw in childhood. She mentioned Arundel Lake with surprise. A Mountain Pearl Inn! The guy smiled and said it was all true. By the way, he never imagined they would meet again. The guy also introduced himself. His name is Lincio. Asha, however, said she was surprised he remembered her, given that it was so long ago. He said they still talk about what happened that day, especially his mother. That magician made a great impression on her. Afterwards, he asked if the magician was still alive. Our heroine began to say his name, and a moment later, she laughed nervously, saying that her teacher was fine. Afterwards, the guy said that special clearances are quite rare. She was probably the first in Yfranger history to receive one for her graduating class. Asha said Professor Eurus knew her teacher, and when she said she was interested in Yfranger, he wrote a recommendation. Lincio, perplexed, asked if she was talking about the weird guy in charge of magical biology. Asha asked why he was weird, and the guy asked her not to let him fool her. The girl, by the way, said she didn't know much about him, only that he was an old acquaintance of her teacher's. Lincio said he could get a little nervous during practice. By the way, at that moment, the guy suggested that if she was here on his recommendation, then that meant she was a commoner. Asha was surprised by the question and said yes. She soon wondered if she should have said it at all. She remembered how Kilts always spoke ill of stupid aristocrats. Asha asked Lincio if he wanted her to start calling him Sir. The boy laughed in bewilderment, saying they were only nobles because of their grandfather. He'd received the title decades ago. There was no need to treat him any differently. Our heroine smiled and looked at him and said that this was even good. At that moment, Lincio asked if he could introduce her to his friend. He was probably in his dorm. Asha, of course, agreed. Our heroine was, of course, only too happy to make new friends. That was until one thing happened. The boys shouted in confusion, saying that Mr. Domino was coming, so they told Asha to crawl under the bed. Inside, she tried to figure out how this had happened. The girl thought she was doing something wrong, while Mr. Dominon told Lincio he still hadn't learned to clean up after himself. The boy scratched his head and apologized. The man nevertheless told Lincio Casor that he was dissatisfied with his behavior. Our heroine was incredibly surprised as soon as she heard the guy's last name. What does Kaisor mean? Mr. Dominon realized it was he, the scoundrel, who had caused the commotion in the girls' dorm. He advised him to be careful because he was watching them. Shortly after, Lincio approached the girl and extended his hand to her, telling her that she could climb out. However, our heroine was still shocked that it was Lincio Casor. At this point, Lincio's friend, Mahiran Rochestanen, asked Lincio if he had given his books to Mrs. Ruth. The guy asked him to listen. He asked Mahiran if he knew how he was caught in the girls' dorm. He had made a deal with Miss Ruth to keep quiet about the book, so he was supposed to give it to her, so she wouldn't tell his parents. Bewildered, Mahiran asked if he knew how rare the book was. Lincio said he knew it was only published in Kuldrogan, but luckily he had a close friend from the north. He was surprised to find one in his collection. Mahiran covered his friend's mouth with his hand. The boy sighed in bewilderment and asked for Lincio's forgiveness. He may seem like a frivolous fool and a thief, but he's actually a good guy. Lincio asked him to stop badmouthing him right in front of Asha. The guy coughed and suggested they leave Asha surprised, asked where they were going. He looked at her in surprise and said they would go to her dorm. However, the girl reminded him of Miss Ruth's words. Lincio in turn reminded her that he'd given her the book, so everything was settled. Mahiran, perplexed, asked his friend if he could at least look guilty. Soon after, our heroine was lying on her bed in her room. Luckily, Lincio's words were indeed enough. She was just thinking about him. It turns out he's a relative of Count Kaisor, whom they met at the lake. Our heroine recently asked him what they were doing there, to which the guy said that they went to Arundel to relax. Our heroine suddenly asked if his grandfather had gone with him. The guy said yes, and also that he had been injured during the trip and was still bedridden. Lincio said it wasn't fatal, but it was in a lot of pain. That's why his parents made him visit every holiday. Our heroine knew for sure that she shouldn't have mentioned Kiltz's name at all. At that very moment, she wondered if she should tell Kiltz about it. However, she assumed that if he found out, it would be very bad. In that case, it would be better to keep everything a secret. Soon our heroine opened the window, thinking that Lincio himself was a good person. So, new place, new friends, learning new things. This trip should be amazing. That evening, she was writing a letter for her dear teacher, Kilt's Iskadian. Although she didn't think it would be easy, getting used to it turned out to be more difficult. The girl said that much of what he taught her is different here. She encounters surprises both in and out of the classroom, and yet the letter still sounded strange, so she decided to rewrite it. Yefranger is beautiful in the fall, no matter where you look. She feels well, the lectures are interesting, the students are friendly. Soon the girl was clutching her head, thinking that all this was a blatant lie. The activities are postponed a week earlier, or to be precise, on the first day of classes. Our heroine, entering the auditorium, realized that there was not a single familiar face around her. However, at that moment, the girl was called to them by Lincio and Mahirin, who waved to her in a friendly manner. Our heroine was incredibly happy that she was in the same class with them. At that moment, the door opened, and everyone had to take their seats. The teacher assumed that none of the students had studied during the break. He decided he needed to refresh his memory and start by making a monostone glow. They were supposed to pair up and compare the stone's brightness, then present the results. Our heroine realized that this was a rather big problem because she didn't know anyone here. Obviously, she didn't know who to partner with, and the people she knew were already taken. Suddenly, a guy approached Asha and assumed that she was single, so he suggested that they team up. Our heroine was, of course, only glad about this, because otherwise she would have been very embarrassed. The guy, looking at her in surprise, said he hadn't seen her there before. Asha Konak introduced herself and said she had recently transferred to a senior class. The classmate nodded and said he understood, but he didn't introduce himself. Asha was surprised by this, and the teacher just brought the monostone. Our heroine, taking the stone in her hands, realized that it was exactly like the stone she used when Kiltz first taught her. The girl happily began to use her magic to light the stone on fire. The light from the stone was so bright that rays of light flew out of the windows and flew further. All the students stared at Asha in horror, but as soon as she opened her eyes, she couldn't understand why everyone was looking at her. At that very moment, the girl realized what had just happened. The action takes us back a bit further. Eurus gave the girl a crest and wand that belonged to a student who had left the academy. The professor said she would use them every day. She should use the remaining time to familiarize herself with them. The girl asked if she could use magic without a wand. Eurus strongly advised her not to do this, because the Astiers are not friendly with northern mages, that is, hereditary mages. Our heroine realized at that moment that she had completely forgotten about the professor's words, and therefore put herself at risk. All the students started whispering, assuming she was from the north. They immediately realized she was the same student who had transferred. The kids couldn't understand what she'd forgotten in her senior year. Others said they'd heard about special access. In any case, right now, Asha was the main target for discussion. At that moment, our heroine was screaming in her head, telling herself that she was a real stone manna egg. After some time, all the students, of course, avoided her, which our heroine was very disappointed about. However, at that moment, a guy approached her who wanted to talk to her. As it turned out, Lincio approached her and asked in surprise if she was really a hereditary magician. The girl said she wasn't trying to hide it from him or anything like that, but the guy's face instantly changed, saying that it was simply amazing. By the way, her teacher also used wandless magic. Asha smiled and said she never used a wand at home and had forgotten that it wasn't usually done that way. Our heroine suddenly asked Mahiran why he was so surprised. He was from the north too, wasn't he? The guy said yes, but a hereditary mage remains rare. Lincio immediately pointed out that if your fellow northerner was so surprised, it wasn't surprising that everyone else was shocked. He asked her to ignore them. Our heroine, of course, tried to think so, but in any case, now everyone is avoiding her. But luckily she had Lincio and Mahiran. She wouldn't have known what she would have done without them. In that case, the girl took up her pen, thinking that she could write more about these too. How are you, Kiltz? I've already made 2 new friends here. Lincio is smart and funny, and never treats me any differently than anyone else, for which she's very grateful. Mahiran is a nobleman from Kaldrogan. He traveled all the way to Astier to study. He is always polite and formal, reminiscent of a fairy tale prince. They are both very good friends. I'm doing well, so please pass on my best wishes to Pram and Grandpa. Sincerely, student Asha Konak. The girl placed her letter in the Kilt's artifact. After some time of training, our heroine finally received her uniform. Now she felt like a part of this academy. However, the girl still forgot where the library was. She needed to remember it quickly. At that moment, she began to walk past some guys who were talking animatedly. Suddenly, one of them noticed Asha and asked the others to take a look. Eventually, their eyes met. Asha clearly remembered that these guys were from her class, but she didn't understand why they stopped talking and why everyone was staring at her. Our heroine decided that the best solution would be to simply walk and as quickly as possible. However, one of the bullies tripped her, causing the girl to trip and almost fall. With great difficulty, she managed to stay on her feet and immediately asked what had just happened. The guy, surprised, said it was his mistake. Asha wanted to say that everything was fine, but the guy interrupted her, saying that next time he would aim better to make her fall. The girl was speechless at these words. The boys started laughing and saying that Kaldrogin had been sending out a lot of spies lately. The boys asked her if they understood correctly that she had come here to spy on them. All they know how to do in the north is steal, and that's not surprising considering they're retarded. The girl screamed, saying she wasn't from Kaldrogin, but from Kalincia, and that it was a separate country. The kids thanked her for the geography lesson, but said the fact remained that she was a country bumpkin. One of them asked why she carried wands when she could use her real magic without them. By the way, weren't those inners things? Where did she steal them from? At that moment, a female voice came from behind them. The girl said that, as far as she remembered, students were forbidden from arguing on school grounds, regardless of the reason. The boys turned their gazes to the girl in bewilderment. It was Filian Lumiane, a charming young woman. One of them immediately started saying they weren't arguing. It was just a normal, friendly conversation. The other guy echoed this, saying it was true and nothing to worry about. In that case, the girl assumed that they would not mind if she reported this friendly conversation. She was sure the dean would be pleased to hear that they had done a wonderful job welcoming their new student. And immediately, the guys turned around in horror and started running away, saying they needed to get out of here immediately. Lumiane tossed her hair, calling them idiots. After that, the girl turned around and asked the new girl if she was okay. Our heroine, surprised, asked if she was really telling her that. Lumine asked, surprised, if she really saw anyone else there. The girl apologized and thanked Filian Lumine. However, the girl said her name was Chloe Lumine. Our heroine said she was her neighbor. Before they met, she was very curious to know what she looked like. One way or another, they have now met, and so she is very happy to see her. At that moment, Chloe walked over to the fountain, telling the girl that she definitely stood out. Our heroine asked again, and the girl asked if she really didn't understand. Right now, all eyes at the academy are on her. Asha said she wasn't trying to stand out. Chloe replied that she wasn't pretending to be ignorant, apparently. Even the highest-ranking aristocrats cannot gain entry to Yefranger without special clearance. Even the dean's grandson must pass an entrance exam. Asha was incredibly surprised because Kiltz and Eurus acted as if nothing special had happened, but it turned out that this was not the case. Chloe said some people assume she's hiding from Kaldrogin, others that she's an Ivory Tower follower. Asha said she's just Asha, nothing more. Our heroine, however, now understood why everyone was looking at her so closely. They must have thought she'd gotten into this through bribery or connections. Chloe also said everyone is waiting for her test results to be posted on the wall. Asha said she never imagined that this was the reason everyone was so interested in her. The girl asked if she could just lay low. Chloe replied that there was no need to be ashamed. Attention is a good thing, and that's what power is all about. Asha responded by saying that all she gets is whispers behind her back. Is that really power? Chloe said she's already experienced the unpleasant side of the double-edged sword of attention. Her main task is to transform attention into admiration or allow it to remain hostile. Asha decided this was too much Chloe, however never said it would be easy. Our heroine looked at the girl with admiration and told her that she was very calm and mature. The girl smiled and asked to call her simply Chloe, without any formalities. Our heroine laughed and said that she should just call her Asha then. Just at that very moment, a familiar voice began calling the girl, so they both turned around. The source of this voice was Lincio and Mahiran, who were walking towards our heroine. Chloe reacted very strangely upon seeing them. She immediately stood up and said goodbye, saying that they might meet again. Lincio approached surprised and asked the girl if she knew who it was. Was that why she hadn't met them in the library? Asha, surprised, asked if he knew Chloe. The guy said that everyone in Yefringer knows about this angel because her beauty is divine. Asha understood her words immediately. Whether to pay attention or admire her, it was entirely up to her. Incidentally, I wonder if all noble children grow up with this mindset. A short time later, the interim results for the training were announced. Our heroine was in second place. The girl couldn't understand how this was possible. She was certain she had thoroughly studied both the theoretical and practical aspects of mystical research. The girl guessed she'd missed a couple of questions in geometry or history. In any case, the gap was so small. Asha suddenly wondered if Kiltz would be disappointed in her if he found out she didn't take first place. Meanwhile, the students whispered in surprise about the newcomer. Our heroine, in turn, was thinking that as a Kiltz student, she should study harder. She'd start reviewing her homework right now. Of course she'll do this right after she visits the kitten. That's exactly what she decided to do. On the academy grounds, our heroine found a small furry miracle, which she often visited to cuddle and check on its condition. While courting the cat, she said she was too adorable. Then the girl asked the cat if he wanted some food. Or did he not eat human food? At that moment, a classmate approached the girl and asked her if he was right in knowing that her name was Asha Konak. Our heroine, perplexed, asked why he was asking this, if he knew perfectly well who she was, since they were in the same class. The man was Dalkian Amadiu. The girl guessed from his expression that he was there to criticize the new student. She tried to guess what he'd say. Probably that he didn't like her. Firstly, because she was a hereditary mage, and secondly, because she was a transfer student. And thirdly, she assumed that Dalkian hated the fact that a commoner like her was attending a school for nobles. However, the guy said all three were wrong. Asha asked him to let her know if he found a fourth reason she hadn't heard of before. Dalkian sighed heavily at that moment and told the girl that she was getting on his nerves. Asha, perplexed, asked what he was talking about, and he told her to be careful with her grades in the future. She shouldn't let herself be overshadowed again. Soon after these words, the guy turned around and went about his business. Our heroine was slightly stunned by this conversation because she didn't understand what had just happened. Who is Luayal Amadieu? He is someone who made a significant contribution to the development of the Astir nation, a pioneer who brought magic to a wider audience. This is the founder of Yefranger and its current dean for many years, the conqueror of wonders, Luayal Amadieu. Dalkian Amadieu, in turn, is the dean's grandson. So Asha wasn't surprised. The name sounded so familiar. Lincio was surprised that she was studying even during breakfast. Asha, in turn, said she should put Dalkian Amadieu to shame. Yet he had an incredible to-do list. Our heroine couldn't understand how this was possible, since even her teacher was far from perfect. Mahiran asked the girl what her teacher was bad at. She said that her teacher could never find anything, and that he was terrible at cooking. Linzio laughed and said Dalkian was a pompous jerk, but he shouldn't let himself be knocked down. It's just his way of making fun of him, almost like a natural occurrence. He had to allow himself to think he was just messing around. Mahiran told his friend he should be less rude, but he couldn't help but agree. Lincio then commented that the other girls seemed to like Dalkian. They said he was the perfect representative of the young democracy. However, our heroine shook her head, saying that this couldn't be true. She found him utterly disgusting. Besides, looks have nothing to do with liking someone. For example, does Lincio really like Chloe just because she has a pretty face? The guy laughed and said that wasn't true. He liked girls who smiled often, who were bright as the sun, honest with their feelings, and had golden hair, just like... Our heroine slammed the table and said it was all true. She'd never be able to get a guy like him. Lincio, shedding a tear, told her she was sweet. The action soon shifts to our heroine's room. She finally sees that the Kiltz box is glowing, meaning he's answered. However, before reading the letter, someone knocked on our heroine's room door. As it turned out, it was Chloe, with whom our heroine successfully became friends after that very incident. Once they were settled, our heroine commented on how much of an asshole Amadieu was. Asha asked if Chloe knew what he'd said to her the other day. In the letter, by the way, Kiltz said everything was fine. Haskan was complaining about his back, and Pram was really bored, but they were both healthy. Chloe incidentally said at that moment that Amadieu wasn't that bad. Kiltz was glad the girl had found friends she could connect with. At that moment, Asha, perplexed, told Chloe that she would never let her friend date a guy like that. In a letter, Kiltz asked Asha to ignore students who were cold to her. It wasn't her fault. Some still have the nasty habit of judging by their heritage, not their actions. Our heroine said that he was very annoying, to which Chloe said that she could not deny that he was the most enviable Firaman. The girl, perplexed, asked what this meant. Kiltz continued in the letter, saying that she could see things differently because she always managed to find the good in everything. He hoped she would gain valuable experience in Yefranger Asha, told Chloe she knew little about arranged marriages, but she wanted her to meet someone nice and live happily ever after. Chloe asked, surprised, who she meant by someone nice. Kiltz had said that human beauty is like a grain of sand. Up close, all you can see is that they're dirty and countless. However, step back, and you'll find a picturesque sandy beach. Asha said at that moment that she had in mind someone she liked and who she would love in return. Chloe thanked the girl and said it was very kind of her. Kiltz asked her to feel free to ask him for help if she had any problems. By the time she read this, he hoped she would have already passed her autumn exams, so he wished her well and would wait for her reply. After the autumn exams, the weather became worse and colder as winter was approaching. Our heroine was surprised that everyone was so cold, so looking at Lincio, she said it was fine. The guy replied that it was because she was from the north. He also said he was so cold because he slept with a hot mana stone. The girl said her grandfather also slept like that because his bones hurt in the cold. Lincio, perplexed, asked if he really looked like an old man. Just then, Mahirin, who had been looking for the boys, arrived. Lincio mentioned hearing that he was taking private lessons from Professor Muslon. Mahirin said rumors spread quickly, but it was true, he was interested in weaponry. Asha asked if they were talking about magical enhancement. The guy said that was true, although there were too few mages to create weapons in such large quantities. He believes that combined with Astier's secret technology, mass production will be possible. At this point, the girl also said that he had said that there were several generations of knights in his family. The boy said it was all true. Many also call their family Sword Caldrigan. He studied swordsmanship with the Northerners from a very early age. Asha said she wasn't surprised now that he held the wand like a sword. She said it was actually very good because his core was completely stable. Lincio was delighted to hear such high praise from a top-notch student. However, he still had a long way to go. He would have to focus on. At that moment, our heroine turned around in surprise. She noticed that a crowd of people had gathered around Dalkian, admiring his skills. The boys didn't want to admit it, but his skill was still impeccable. The magic sword he created was simply perfect. At that moment, the guy raised his head, because he noticed someone's too intent gaze. Seeing Asha looking at him, the guy immediately smiled slyly and stared at her. The girl snorted, thinking that he might be a talented magician, but she still found him disgusting. In any case, she went to Mahirin and asked him to help her practice. Mahirin was only happy about this, so after a while, our heroine was busy with work. Our heroine twirled her wand and emitted a whole bunch of mana from it. Mahirin, looking at this, said it was very beautiful. He envied hereditary mages who could freely wield any magic regardless of element. At that moment, Asha assumed his element, if she wasn't mistaken, was water. Was he trying to possess others? The guy said his elemental test results showed water. Mahirin never considered studying anything else again. At that moment, our heroine asked if she remembered correctly that the Astiers didn't believe in the theory of the 5 elements. The guy said that, in fact, this is the main difference from Northern magic. Personally, he believes that the 5th element acts as an intersection linking the other 4 together. His teacher said that magic is the result of interaction between people and the world. So if you removed the magic caster from the equation, the entire concept of magic wouldn't exist. In this case, it turns out that the 5th element, the caster, acts as a point of intersection. Asha said that's correct, as long as the caster is convinced all elements will be open to them. Mahirin then asked why Yafranger was sending his students to take the aptitude test Lincio, then asked what they were talking about. Our heroine said that learning several elements takes a lot of time. Focusing on one might be more practical. Mahirin found this convenient. By the way, in practice, magic doesn't seem to be as terrible as Kiltz described it. Anyway, the action shifts to the library. Asha, picking up a book, decided there was one here that would be useful to Mahirin. Reaching for the top shelf, the girl tried to get the book she needed. However, just before she could take the book, someone got ahead of her and took it. Our heroine turned around in bewilderment, and it turned out that this was the work of Dalkian, who said that he took her first. The girl immediately asked him what he wanted to get for it. The guy said he wanted an introduction to the advanced theory of elements. She was interested in that, right? Our heroine looked at him in bewilderment and said that he didn't even know what she was talking about. In that case, the guy said that might be true, but it was still a bit boring for him. And yet he didn't let her go. And before he did, he called out to her. The girl turned around confused and asked what he wanted from her. The guy pressed her against the wall and began to look closely into her eyes. He decided not to beat around the bush, so he asked the question directly. Why was she running away from him? Our heroine, nevertheless, decided to pretend that she didn't understand, so she asked in surprise what he was talking about. The guy repeated his question. Asha asked if it was really that obvious. It was because he hated her. He was offended that her name was on the board below. However, Dalkian said he didn't say he hated her. Asha, confused, asked if that wasn't what he meant. In any case, if that's all, then she asked to let her go and move away because she wants to leave. However, he stopped her again, saying that he was proposing to her to arrange a competition for the winter exam. He was against her. Our heroine was very surprised by this proposal, so she turned around and asked why this was necessary. The guy said it would be an honor for him as the dean and for her as her teacher. Asha tried to stop him and ask why she should participate. Dalkian thought the relationship between student and teacher was especially valuable in the North. Our heroine said that was true, but is it related? Anyway, Asha said that she doesn't know why he hates her so much, but if she wins, she wants him to stop talking to her. This request touched the guy incredibly, but he could do nothing but agree. The action shifts to Professor Travian's lesson. She announced that the winter exam would be replaced by practical classes. Graduating classes don't usually take exams like this, but Professor Flinorf received a large shipment of something rare. Someone wondered if they were dragon eggs. The professor said dragon eggs are much larger, and she was holding a upake egg. These are distant descendants of dragons, a subspecies if you will. The task will be to crack this egg. The guys asked if they should really dissect it while it was still an egg. Travian said that if they wanted to see it hatch, she wouldn't recommend it. The girl said their safety was far more important to her. The victims of the upake attack left much to be desired. Soon the chatter began. Linzio said that even the final exam always involved dragon bones or blood. Looking at Asha, he suspected the Northerners wouldn't like this. Mahiran assumed the Astirs were trying to convey that all that was hidden was coming to light. In any case, the guy said that in the North, Yupik are considered very docile. He didn't expect such a sinister description. At that moment, our heroine asked in surprise if he would crack the egg. The guy replied that he didn't have much of a choice. Looking at the egg, Asha said that was the whole problem. She didn't like the idea of having to kill a living creature to get good grades. She really didn't want to dissect a dragon, even if it was some ordinary subspecies. The girl pondered for a long time what to do, but soon the imaginary scales made their choice. She would come up with something for her report. Moreover, she understood that she might lose the bet to Dalkian, but no one could force her to kill this egg, not even herself. The girl proudly decided that instead of all this, she would incubate it. Linzio, looking at the pensive Asha, guessed that she was up to something again. That evening, our heroine learned that the Upake's natural habitat is permafrost. They are among the most unique and beautiful of all mystical creatures. When Upake grow up, they develop 3 pairs of enormous wings. The girl assumed this wasn't what she was looking for. Where's the part about how they hatch from eggs? That's when she found a paragraph about it. So they hatch only 1 egg at a time, and it takes about 2 months for development. Soon she began to flip through the pages of the book to find at least something important. But unfortunately, she did not find it. She sighed heavily, scratched her head, and decided that she would just keep him warm. Covering the Upik egg with a blanket, she hoped that the dragon would still be able to hatch. So the action shifts to 2 months later. Our heroine stood before Miss Travian, who expressed her disappointment in Filian Konak. She even said her expectations were too high. Our heroine knew the professor would say the entire report was a complete lie. But there was one thing. She gave her another chance, asking her to do better next time. The girl realized she had no other choice. She couldn't crack that egg. However, before our heroine had time to leave the office, someone grabbed her and dragged her along. The girl turned her head, and to her surprise, noticed it was Dalkian. She asked what was going on. Nevertheless, the boy glared at her menacingly and ordered her to follow him silently. She became frightened and nodded her head. A moment later, the girl experienced déjà vu, because he again pressed her against the wall. Only this time, he asked why she did it. Asha, confused, asked what he was talking about. Dalkian replied that he thought they'd agreed on a competition. Our heroine was a bit distracted. She was so busy caring for the egg that she completely forgot about the argument. By the way, at that same moment, she also noticed that he was looking at her sadly. The girl turned her head, saying that she had lost, and therefore asked to end it. He in turn said he couldn't accept it because they hadn't competed properly. Asha said it was the best she could write. The guy asked her not to make fun of him, as her report was completely inappropriate. The girl was surprised by this and asked how he knew that he shouldn't have read it. He said Professor Trevienne showed it to him. She was worried she was having trouble teaching. Asha asked, confused, "Did the professor really show him her notes?" The guy said it was true. After these words, a gloomy silence fell in the hallway. Our heroine hung her head and said that she didn't do the task at all because she felt sorry for the egg, so she faked the report. Looking at Dalkian, she asked if he was happy with this answer. He looked at her in confusion and said he didn't understand why they did that since it was their winter exam. Asha asked if he'd completed the assignment. He said he'd dissected him and analyzed everything from his skeleton fluids and structure right down to the various habits he could deduce from his physical reactions. The guy asked why he should have any doubts. Since it wasn't humans hearing these words, our heroine was in incredible shock. Without saying a word, the girl kicked him in the leg, the boy feeling it was incredibly surprised. Our heroine, in turn, told Dalkian Amadou that he was the worst person she had ever met. Soon, Linzio was laughing, saying that in her eyes, he was like that. When they were little, he was the only one who could touch a dead animal without hesitation. Asha said this guy seemed born without emotions, which is why he irritates her with his strange words. Linzio still insisted he wasn't that bad. The guy said he once mistook him for a girl, and he got angry at him. Asha, surprised, asked if it was true. Linzio nodded his head, saying that Dalkian had shoulder-length hair and looked like a cute little angel. He took the hairpin from his mother's jewelry box and gave it to him, but he got angry and threw the same hairpin in his face. Asha, hearing this story, was very surprised. Linzio also said they had a serious fight. He eventually burst into tears, and they were stopped. Asha giggled, saying it was a little funny. The guy also said that if his grandfather hadn't forced him to be nice to him, they would never have gotten along. Our heroine asked why. She also asked about her grandfather, how often he communicated with him. Does he write letters or telegrams? The guy said he forbade him from communicating with him for the semester. At first, he sent him a telegram every day, saying he wanted to return. However, our heroine reminded him that he was very proud to have entered Yefranger when they first met in Arendon. Our heroine even said that this is what made her want to come here. The boy looked down at that moment, embarrassed. In truth, he'd been watching her for several days before finally speaking. He realized that they were about the same age, so he hoped that they could become friends. And so they finally met, and they were still in the same class. Linzio sincerely said he was glad to see her again. Walking down the corridor that evening, our heroine told herself that she too was very glad to meet Linzio again, but she didn't know if she could say the same about this academy, which seemed uncomfortable to her. Asha had no doubt that Astier's magic was simply amazing. Every day, a wide variety of research is published by them. Mastering magic enriches people's lives. It also creates an inexorable desire to invent useful tools. Astier de Luynes. This is a city of light that brings people genuine joy. Our heroine understood that it wasn't all that bad, but she didn't want to agree with Astier's fundamental beliefs. In her opinion, magic should be mysterious and secretive. Stroking the opaque egg, Asha said that she was the only one left among her kind. This, by the way, was similar to Kiltz's magic. She had to keep his secret because the world didn't need to know about it. She also knew there was no need to crack the egg and see what was inside. Soon the girl decided to read a book, something she hadn't done in a long time. She chose a report on the physiological effects of magical power on the human body, prepared by Ascadion. When an ordinary person comes into contact with a high concentration of mana, it causes a negative reaction in which the body attacks itself and eventually collapses. This is all done by introducing magic into test subjects born without mana sensitivity. This is all happening without measuring the various reactions. The report itself was created to develop countermeasures against this phenomenon. Asha began reading about the test subjects. Number 9. Complaining of sharp pain in her eyes after the mana injection, our heroine soon closed the book. She didn't want to believe it, but the handwriting was definitely Kiltz's. Having arrived here, our heroine has learned a lot, so such inhumane acts no longer shock her. Somehow, even though it's been so long, it must be lonely. Winter arrived shortly afterward. Dalkian, as always, wore a look of contempt as he passed Asha. Our heroine didn't understand what was wrong with him, and Mahiran asked her not to worry, because he wasn't worthy of her attention. Asha laughed and told the guy that he could be very cruel. Anyway, it's time for the founding festival. The girl asked if there would be a celebration in Arenville Mahiran, said that unlike the Northerners, the Astiers don't celebrate their founding day. Asha, perplexed, asked if they really weren't doing anything at the start of a new year. Mahiran said that, because of many facts, they hate to acknowledge their influence. At that moment, our heroine mentioned that she had to run errands. She said she needed to stop by Erinville so they'd see each other next week. The guy smiled and asked if she was really going on an excursion in such weather with all this snow. Our heroine said that everything was fine, because the postman said that he couldn't come today, so she was going to the post office to pick up her gifts from home. The guy asked if he could walk her home, since it was safer together, to which our heroine replied that everything was fine. She grew up in the very heart of Calincia. After a while, they were walking through snowdrifts, and the boy asked if the teacher had really sent her a gift for the Foundation Festival. Asha said yes, but it was also a gift for her birthday. Mahiran, surprised, said he wished he'd known about her birthday sooner. The girl said she'd decided to make the Foundation Festival her birthday because she didn't know when her real birthday was. The guy, perplexed, began to apologize, saying he hadn't meant to offend her. The girl waved her hand and said everything was fine. In that case, he decided to ask what happened to her parents. Our heroine said she was from Nurmazar. She lived with her stepfather before she met her teacher. Her stepfather told her that he found her on the shore one day, so she doesn't know who her real parents are. At this point, our heroine asked him if he had received anything in honor of the festival. The guy said he probably wouldn't get anything because he was considered the black sheep of the family. Asha, perplexed, asked how that could be. The boy said his family didn't like the fact that not only had he failed to become a knight, but he'd also gone to another country to study. Asha said that was understandable, but why hadn't he become a knight? Mahiran pointed to his hand and said he couldn't use it. Asha guiltily began to say she didn't know and that she was asking for forgiveness. The boy said it was fine, as it didn't interfere with his daily life. However, he'd like to help his older brother in some way. By the way, the guy decided to say that he told this story only to her. Asha asked what that meant. The guy replied that he personally believed that Caldrogan would face destruction and decline unless it learned to imitate Astier's technology. Our heroine looked at him and asked if he really thought so. The guy said that all the magicians of the Ivory Tower had long since departed for the other side of the world. His Majesty is currently incapable of ruling, no matter how treasonous that may sound. Astier is using the moment to increase his power. Incidentally, even now he's preparing for war against Izmacan. Our heroine asked if he truly believed Astier would start a war. The guy replied that before she enrolled at this academy, there was a student named Ineril de Armanda Shah, said she heard that she left the academy mid-semester. However, the guy said that she did not leave the academy but was expelled. The de Armand family was the most aggressive in the war as a whole, which was natural. However, the head of the family, Dean Luail, became dissatisfied with his child. The so-called cleansing would be a more accurate description of what happened to Inerli. The next day, our heroine couldn't stop thinking about Inerl de Armand. Was this her room? The girl sighed and, starting to open the box, decided that she would ask Chloe about this later. Opening the box, our heroine found a carrot cake. The signature was a wish for a little star. It was Pram's handwriting. She knew it was his doing. However, our heroine also discovered something on the back of the note. There was a short, concise inscription on it. I helped. It was undoubtedly written in Grandpa's hand. In any case, she set about opening the other gifts. Our heroine noticed the next gift, a beautiful snow-white robe. It must have been from Kilt's. It was so soft and pleasant to the touch. The girl decided she would keep it for a special occasion. At that moment, she heard a strange noise behind her, so she turned her head to check. The reason for this was that the egg was apparently already hatching. She knew it would happen soon, but she wasn't ready yet. The girl ran toward the egg in terror, thinking about Professor Travian's words. She needed to fight off Upake with this robe. However, there was no need to do this. As soon as the egg was crushed, a snow-white Upake emerged, even purring. Our heroine was incredibly touched, because he's charming. None of what Professor Travian said was true. The baby immediately accepted the girl as his mother and rushed to lick her. Our heroine was delighted. She said he was as white as snow and that she would call him Ease. After some time, our heroine sat down at the table because she needed to write something to her family. Incidentally, Kilt seems disappointed that she hasn't been home since she started studying at Yafranger. All his letters are filled with disappointment. In any case, when she started writing the letter, she decided that she would not mention Linzio. But what should she write about? She wasn't sure anything would arouse Kilt's suspicions. Glancing at Ease, our heroine asked if he wanted to go for a walk. He joyfully began to kiss the girl's hand, making it clear that he really wanted to go for a walk. Our heroine wrapped him in a scarf, saying that she knew he was uncomfortable, but she asked him not to move. After some time, she came to a place where she could let Ease roam freely. She was delighted that Ease liked the place. She believes all her research was worth it. However, at that moment, Yupik, for some unknown reason, assumed a fighting stance. Our heroine grabbed him, telling him to be quiet. No one should hear them. Somehow she couldn't understand what had the little one so upset. At that very moment, a familiar voice was heard behind our heroine, asking Konak what she was doing there.